Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and it is off-season time. We have wrapped up 2023 in terms of the major region games that we are getting, and we now are getting right into the off-season. In fact, we've been getting into the off-season for basically a month now. It's crazy how quickly a lot of these teams started to move. As soon as the Western teams were eliminated from Worlds, it felt like they were the ones that were going out there and making those roster changes. We've been locked on a lot of these rosters for a little while now, but in today's video, we're going to be going over all 10 of the LEC teams, their rosters and what they're reportedly looking like in 2024. Some of them have been confirmed, some of them have been locked in. A lot of these are technically still rumors, but you know, with the sheep leakers out there, it's really hard to say that they're not going to come true. We're basically at 99% on all of these, and so I'm excited to go over it. I'm excited to kind of get into some off-season content. This is probably my favorite time of the year to be covering League of Legends because I think the roster changes and the shakeups and, you know, projecting and predicting what teams might look good and what teams might look bad is a lot of fun. And so I'm excited to hear you guys' opinion down in the comment section as well. This video is basically entirely opinions, and so I'm sure there's going to be some disagreements down in the comments. And as long as you guys have those conversations respectfully, I love, you know, having those conversations with you guys down in the comments. I'm certainly not the end-all be-all in terms of opinions. I like to think that my track record does speak for itself a little bit on this channel. I've done very well with these videos in the past, but you know, there's going to be some things that I get right and some that I get wrong, and I would love to know where we disagree down in the comments below. But without further ado, let's jump right into the video. What we're going to be doing is going team by team, talking about, you know, what the roster looked like last year and how it's changing going into 2024, whether I think they're doing better or worse. I want to make it abundantly clear at the beginning of this video, this is not a power rankings video. I will be doing a more in-depth predictions and power rankings video as we get closer to the season, as I have time to watch significantly more tape on some of the, you know, the players that we don't have as much tape on from the LEC, some players that I didn't watch a ton of. In 2023, I've watched tape on everybody that I'm going to talk about in this video, an extensive amount, but, you know, I don't want to make any sort of predictions or lock-ins until we get there. What this video is for is to grade whether or not these teams are moving in the right direction, whether I like the decisions that they're making, whether I like the direction that these teams are going in, or whether I think they're making some interesting decisions. And I think especially for the LEC, this is a more interesting conversation than it has been in the past, you know, couple of years with the salary cap being implemented. And so up on your screen right now, you're going to see the key, the kind of grading scale, I guess, for today's video. We'll kind of go over it very, very quickly. A+ is going to be your best of region players. If I give an A+ grade to any player, that's going to be, you know, yes, like you are the best player in your region, or you are very close, and you should be treated as such. Acquiring a player like that is franchise changing. And then you have superstars, which are your A's. Not exactly like your A+, like almost guaranteed to be an MVP caliber player, but players that will still completely change the trajectory of how your team plays. A- is about elite. Once you get to your B's, your B+ are your consistently good starters, players that you're very happy to be trotting out basically every single game and are going to give you good things. B's are going to be basically the same output at their best, but they're going to be a little bit more inconsistent about when you get their best. Some of those players are just as good as the players in B+ or even A, but you're not going to be getting the same kind of output from game to game that you would from the other players. Once you get to B-, you're at the players that are good as starters. Definitely, you're okay with them being in your starting lineup, but they're not game breakers, or they do have some major flaws in their game that kind of stand out in comparison to some of the other players ranked above them. And then once you get into the C's, your C+ is going to be your weak starter. Like, you're okay with them in the starting lineup, but they're certainly not going to be, you know, game breaking, probably one of the weaker starters at their position in the league. If you get to a C, that's a player that if they are starting for you, it's borderline, like you really should be looking for an upgrade in that position. And then if you get to a C-, that's probably not a starter, in my opinion. Now, I want to make it abundantly clear that all of these players could perform very differently than the grades that I give them here. This is not a ranking of how good I think these players are immediately. This is an assessment, I guess I should say, about how valuable I think these players are as assets. And so if I give a player a B+ grade as an asset, that doesn't mean that they're instantly going to be a consistently good starter, but that's what I think these orgs are valuing them as. They're valuing them as a consistently good starter and somebody that should be paid or acquired accordingly, you know, acquired over players that are lower than that accordingly. And so These are, of course, my opinions. That's the other big caveat here. At the end of the day, all I can do is give you my opinion on where I think I would value these players and whether or not I would value them over or under other players around them. But this is kind of the key that I'm going to be working off of. If I'm 1 or 2 off of, you know, your opinion, like if I give a player a B grade and you're like, wow, they definitely deserve to be B+, or even A-, or they definitely are probably more of a B-, they're not as consistent as you think they are, that's fine. We're probably a lot closer than you think we are. These are just kind of baseline grades. I think the explanations that I'll give for a lot of these players are going to be more in-depth than any of the one particular letter grade up on the screen is going to be. Only other thing that I want to point out, if you see an asterisk next to a player, that does denote that they are an import. That will affect their grade. Imports are going to be considered less valuable just inherently because they take up an import slot. However, that matters significantly less here in the LEC than it will in the LCS video that I make in a couple of days here, because you just don't run into issues where you're, you know, trying to fit in a ton of imports oftentimes in the LEC. It usually doesn't matter if you're taking up 1 or 2 import slots because there's enough good European players to supplement the rest of the roster. It doesn't, you know, drag down your value or prop up the value of endemic players like it would a North American player in the LCS. And so with all of that preamble out of the way, it's time to officially jump into the content. What we're going to be doing is going team by team, and we're going to be going in the order that they finished at the end of the year in 2023, from 1st to 10th. And so, you know, we'll be talking about championship points. We'll be talking about how everybody ended up landing. But of course, kicking off our #1 spot and our #1 seed, it is G2 Esports. They're going to be talked about first, and luckily for us, this is a pretty easy conversation to have, because if you can see up on the screen, they didn't make any changes going into 2024, which I think is very, very interesting. It's obviously the right decision if they're able to retain everybody, and, you know, everybody was willing to take a pay cut, or at least some players were willing to take pay cuts to stay on this team. They dominated Europe last year. It wasn't a particularly big surprise to see them be the best team at Europe. It was a little surprising to see them underperform, quote unquote, at Worlds. I predicted them not to get out of the group stage. That was a big, bold take that I had going into Worlds. That one aged very well, but I think this team definitely has the upside to get better as the rest of, you know, this year goes on. And we'll kind of talk about what you're seeing up on the screen now. On the left, you know, it's a little bit difficult to show my point on this slide in particular, but on the left is going to be the 2023 version of the roster, and on the right will be the 2024 version of the roster. So you can see, you know, the players that they had last year, the players that they have next year, and whether or not I think that is an upgrade, a downgrade, a change, or a no change. Those are the 4 grades that I'm going to be giving out. You know, upgrades obviously mean I think this player is better immediately, and I think that they're better for the org to have. Downgrade means the opposite. I think that you're probably going from a more valuable player to a less valuable player. There is a change grade, which is basically me saying they're not necessarily an upgrade or a downgrade. They're either lateral movement, you know, players of similar skill level, or you're going from, you know, an established veteran that's okay to a youngster who might be a little bit worse at first but has the upside to be better, or no change. As you can see on the screen here for G2, that's across the board. No changes here for this team. So let's go ahead and talk about these players individually, just to kind of give you an idea of where I feel they're standing. I've Broken Blade at around an A- grade. I think he's probably the best top laner in the LEC. I certainly don't think that is a guaranteed crown for him. I think he's a very good player, and he got better as the year went on last year, which is super impressive. But, you know, for somebody who I was considering kind of a channel, what's the opposite of a channel darling? Somebody that I was a lot lower on, I think, than consensus. Broken Blade has basically completely changed my opinion on him. He has completely learned how to play weak side on this G2 team. A lot of the flaws that we were explaining about him when he was on TSM or when he was on Schalke, when he was, you know, given a lot of resources to be this big hyper carry for the team, but wasn't nearly as consistent when he wasn't getting those resources. I think G2 has kind of worked a lot of that out of him. I don't know if it's the coaching staff. I don't know if it's just a mentality thing, him going to a bigger org with better players, feeling more comfortable playing a lower resource style, but he's essentially gotten a lot more consistent on that side of the map, but he still can carry in the same way that he was able to for a lot of the other teams that he played for, which is why his value has gone up. Now, I think there is an argument to be made that his value is closer to a B+, that there isn't an A-graded top laner in the LEC. I think that there certainly is a conversation to be had around that, but I think if there is an A-graded, you know, value top laner, it's probably Broken Blade. I don't think there is a single player that I would rather have on my team than Broken Blade. Not only is he not an import like the other player that I think you would consider for this spot, but his performances have been just as good, if not better, than any other top laner. So Definitely good to keep him. Yike was everything you could have asked for and then some last year for this G2 team. I think I value Yike a little bit higher than maybe some other people will. I'm definitely going to expect some comments about how it's more the system than it is the player with Yike, because every jungler that comes into G2 just seems to be able to make it work. But I think Yike showed significant development over the course of last year. I think maybe if you were talking about him in winter or in spring, yeah, he's probably closer to a B+, like a very solid, top-end jungler, but maybe not like an elite A level jungler. But I think what we saw out of him in summer really convinced me that no, this is an A- like level prospect. Like, he is a really, really good asset. He is already one of the best junglers in the LEC. For my money, he was the most consistent jungler across 2023. I know that's a little bit of a hot take with, how some people perceive some of the other junglers, but I think Yike was the most consistent, maybe not the highest highs, but the most consistent. And, the big concern with him was that he couldn't play tanks, but that certainly wasn't the case down the stretch. Then you have Caps in the mid lane. What else do I need to say about Caps? Whenever games matter the most, he steps up. He's still going to get an A grade. He didn't play like an A player for the majority of 2023, but in the playoffs, he was really good, and at Worlds, he was really good. I think it isn't a motivation thing. It's more of a, limit testing thing with Caps. It's not necessarily that he's not trying. We've talked about some players in other regions that take time off in the regular season mentally and just kind of coast and don't really try as hard as they do in some of the games that matter a bit more. That's not necessarily Caps. I don't think that it's a lack of effort or anything like that. I just think that Caps knows he's better than other people, and so he picks a lot of this wacky, zany stuff and goes wacky, zany builds and plays a lot more aggressive and limit testy in the regular season, and then when you get to those important games, that's when he's going to lock in. I still trust Caps a lot. If you wanted to give him an A+ grade because he's the best player that the LEC has ever had, I think that is fine. He's not going to get that from me. Only one player is going to get that from me in the LEC, as we can see here, but then we get to maybe a more controversial grade, and that's going to be Hans Sama at B+. He's the only player on this G2 team that doesn't have an A grade. He gets the B+ grade. I still think he's arguably the most valuable AD carry in the region, but as we're going to see as we go throughout a lot of these grades throughout the rest of this video, I mean, AD carry is like a giant clump of B+, B, and B- players. There's really not a lot of A players. There's really not a lot of C players. It's a lot of good AD carries in Europe right now that, are inconsistent in the sense that they're not always going to be as dominant as maybe you would hope. Hans is probably the exception to that. Now, how much of that last year was the fact that he was playing with the best support in the region and also playing with the most consistent jungler in the region, and the fact that, he was given a lot of resources in the early game, he's the best laner, yada yada. You can make these arguments that Hans isn't exactly an A-tier player on a different org, which is the argument I would be making. I think if you took him off of G2, he's closer to a B+, but even a B+ is a lot more valuable than what he was able to do in 2022 on Team Liquid. Like, this is already a pretty huge upgrade. I think, obviously, his laning is ridiculous. He's the best AD carry as a laner in the entire league. His team fighting can be a little bit hit or miss, and especially if he's put into bad positions, if he's put into a position where he's camped early and has to play from behind, he's not exactly the best AD carry to play out of that spot, even in the LEC, but if you get him online, if you get him into his comfort spot, he's just as good as any other AD carry, if not better than any other AD carry in the region. And then mikyx is going to be the only player that I have getting an A+ grade here. He was just the best player in the LEC last year, and it's not particularly close in my eyes. He was dominating games on things like Braum, and you just don't really see a lot of other players being able to do that. I have confidence that he's going to be able to pick up any support in the game and perform at a high level. I'm not quite as sold on him when it comes to like enchanter metas, but it doesn't really seem like we're moving into one of those. I think obviously if he needs to pick up marksman with how things moved on in the end of 2023, I think that that's possible, but he's just so mechanically talented. He's great in lane, but he's a phenomenal team fighter. It really feels like G2 unlocked that confidence again. I was pretty out on mikyx after 2022. That stint on Excel was just really bad. I know a lot of people don't remember how bad it was, but go watch a lot of the videos, not only that I was putting out at the time, but that everybody was putting out at the time. Mickey was inting for that team in the regular season, and he was a big reason why that team ended up falling to Fnatic in that playoff series. He was miserable in that series, but whenever G2 magic is there, I don't know if it's effort, I don't know if it's comfort with some of the players that he's playing with, and Mickey was back to being arguably the best version of him that we've ever seen on G2. In fact, I would make that argument. That was the best version of mikyx that had ever existed in 2023, and if you're getting that version again, this team is going to be just as dominant. To be able to dominate the LEC like they did in 2023, for the salary cap to be implemented for basically every other team to get weaker in one way or another, at least in the immediate sense, and for G2 to be able to retain everybody, that is a massive success. It's the best thing that could happen to this org in the offseason, and they are primed once again to be the dominant force in Europe for another year. And then moving on to the team that got second in the LEC last year, the number 2 seed at Worlds. It was You know, a team that definitely had a roller coaster of a year. You're going to be hearing me say that a couple of times about basically every team in the LEC with how drastic the standings changed over the course of the year, but the number 2 seed at Worlds was Fnatic, and I don't think a lot of people saw that coming, and me included, going into the summer split. I was very low on this team and on this org and just on what they were able to put out. I thought the addition of Trimby was obviously very, very important for them, but this top side I still wasn't super sold on, and I know there's already going to be people in the comment section that look at the grades that I'm giving Fnatic here and saying they're way too low for players that have had, you know, ridiculous amounts of upside over the past few months or even years for some of these players, but just allow me to explain, allow me to, I guess, give my reasoning for why I have these players all basically in the same spot as a pretty average, you know, team in terms of construction, which generally might be pretty good in the LEC next year. Their lineup last year was Oscar Rinnan in the top lane, Razork in the jungle, Humanoid in the mid lane, Noah at AD carry, and Trimby at support, at least in the summer split after all the changes. And their lineup this year is Oscar Rinnan in the top lane, Razork in the jungle, Humanoid in the mid lane, Noah at AD carry, and June at support. They're bringing in, you know, an import here at support who played for KDF last year on the LCK. As somebody who covered every single game of the LCK last year, I do definitely have thoughts on June, which I will get into, but let's talk about the players that are retained first and foremost, and that's everybody on the top side of the map. That's everybody with the exception, I should say, of support. So we'll talk about Oscar first. I think Oscar's a really interesting player. I think he's sometimes, you know, a little bit overhyped by some of the community. I think a lot of people look at Fnatic top laners and they're like, oh, he's, you know, going to be this superstar. They obviously trust him a lot, but he had his problems last year. Let's not pretend like he just immediately settled in to this role of being a very good top laner. He ended up getting there, I think, by the end of the year, but he was miserable in spring. Like, he was the worst top laner in the LEC in spring, and I think that is, I guess, up for debate because there were some bad top laners last year, but Oscar Rinnan was probably leading the pack in terms of what he was able to put out. Now, he was a lot better in summer. I think he settled in. I think he got a lot more confident with the playstyle that he was asked to play. He was really kind of not a tank player in the ERLs. It was something that, you know, when he was playing for Fnatic Queso, he was much more of this, like, hyper carry player, which is why I thought they were bringing him up in the first place. Was I thought they wanted to play more for topside. I thought that was kind of the intention behind playing him over a player like Wunder, who's a lot more, I would say, comfortable on weak side, you know, more of that 1v1 duelist type of player. But Oscar was kind of just asked to play the Wunder role for this team after replacing him, and he didn't necessarily settle into that role super well. Once he was given a little bit more time, I think, to get used to that role, he got better at it, and I think obviously he's still a very versatile player, but to call him consistent, I think would still be a little bit of a reach for me. That's what B+ is. It's a very consistent, you know, good starter. Oscar's going to have performances that are just as good as any of the other B+ top laners. He's just not going to be able to do that from a game-to-game performance, in my opinion, which is why he comes in as a B. Then you have Razork and Humanoid. I'm going to talk about these two together because I find it very strange that this is kind of the core of Fnatic at this point. I understand why, from a talent perspective, this org has very much decided to go for Razork and Humanoid, you know, as kind of their building blocks, their building center, their core, whatever you want to call it. I just don't necessarily agree with this. I think these two have very weird synergy together. It's very rare for both of them to perform well in the same game, and I've kind of identified why on this channel over the past, you know, couple of months. And that's because I think both of them really like resources early, or alternatively, both of them want to be able to play really fast and really aggressive early, which is why when they do win, it actually looks really good. When Razork is like playing from ahead and actually able to control the pacing of the jungle matchup, which allows Humanoid to push up and play a lot more aggressive and is isolated 1v1 in the mid lane, I think both of them very much benefit from that playstyle. The problem is that when one of it goes wrong, if Humanoid, you know, doesn't necessarily have as much pressure in the mid lane, or if Razork doesn't have as much early pressure in the jungle, the other doesn't necessarily try to adapt to that playstyle. Razork will run it down in the jungle, you know, just losing priority in the mid lane and getting roamed on and dying 2v1, trying to contest Scuttle Crab. It's happened multiple times over the past year. And more specifically, Humanoid will just continuously press up in the mid lane, even in relatively bad matchups, even when Razork doesn't have the pressure to be able to match, when he's susceptible to ganks. We've talked about the infamous Humanoid level 3, where I feel like he died about 100 times last year, level 3. It just is so consistent as a play against him. I was surprised that teams didn't do it more often in the playoffs, because it was something that I was seeing super consistently out of teams against Fnatic, but, you know, we did clean up his playstyle a bit, and I think Razork played a lot better as the year went on. on. I think if these two can continue to play a fast, appropriate style, they're going to be great. They looked really good in the playoffs. They looked really good in the season finals, and they looked pretty good at Worlds. They're just not players that I trust to be consistent from a game-to-game basis, specifically in the regular season. We were talking about how there are some players out there that, in my mind, kind of have this, mentality of not taking the regular season games as seriously. And unfortunately, Humanoid definitely has that. I feel like his regular seasons have always been significantly worse than his big games. And Razork, I think, definitely can lose focus, and he's a really bad player from behind. I think both definitely deserve to be considered, at the very least, good starters, which is why they're considered inconsistent good starters. But you just can't watch their regular seasons last year and tell me that they are consistently great every single game. It's really hard for me to believe that. And then you have Noah. I'm actually really happy that this team was able to retain Noah. There were a lot of rumors throughout this offseason that they were targeting players like Karzi, and I think Noah is just a better version of that at the current moment. Yes, he does take up an import slot, which is certainly something to consider, but Noah was really good for a majority of the summer split. I think he was a top 2, top 3 AD carry in the LEC for his time in the LEC. Obviously, he had a lot of help around him. I think Razork had a phenomenal summer split, and Trimby was playing really well in the support position, but I think if you give Noah a bit more time to get a little bit more comfortable, to maybe weed out some of the mistakes that we obviously saw in some of the bigger games that he was playing down the stretch, I think he has the mechanics to be a top 1 AD carry in the LEC. So I was really confused and concerned with the idea that they were going to replace him for somebody that, in my opinion, was basically just him, but with lower upside in Karzi. I think Noah's a really solid player, and I think they're going to be very happy to retain him. I don't think people are going to look at this B grade and be shocked. But then, the big change for Fnatic this offseason, the one major adjustment that this team ended up making was going from Trimby to June in the support position. I'm not entirely sure why they felt like they needed to make this decision. Maybe they wanted to get Noah a bit more comfortable on this team with the Korean support, but I'll be honest, as somebody who watched every single game of the LCK last year, June was not good. He was just a bad support. We've seen supports come in from the LCK or from the Challengers League in the past. Here in the LEC, a player like Jonghoon comes to mind and perform at a really high level, somebody that has really leveled up the team that he has played for. But June doesn't have that same kind of upside, in my opinion, which is why he's getting a C+. I think there's a world where he comes in and is a good support for this team because of the synergy that he potentially has with Noah here. Obviously, I imagine that's why they're making this decision, but I think it would be wrong to grade this as anything other than a downgrade. I think Trimby has shown significantly more as an individual player. His laning is the best of any support in the entire league. I don't even think that's really all that up for debate. He's not a bad team fighter, but really it's the 2v2, the isolated 2v2 that he really separates himself in. And I think allowing Noah to have a little bit of an easier time in the face of the game that I think he's a little bit less consistent at was really good for Fnatic. June just didn't really show any of that for KDF last year. Now, there were times for DRX's Challengers team that I was impressed with him. Talked about that going into 2022. I don't think it was enough to justify this import, if I'm being entirely honest. I think this is a mistake. I think he is likely to be one of the weaker supports in the LEC this year, if I had to guess. And if you're spending an import on that, and especially if you're going from what I would consider to be a top 2 support in the LEC to maybe a bottom 2 one, it's just not the direction I personally would have liked to go. I do think this team, from an objective standpoint, probably got worse over the course of this offseason. We're going to be saying that about quite a few teams, but I think if you're able to retain the core, and if you like the core, like if you're a fan of Razork plus Humanoid, and if you think Noah and Oscar have a ton of room to grow, then I think you're going to be fine with this offseason for Fnatic. You're not going to be frustrated. I just don't think this is the best they could have done. Trimby's going to be teamless going into next year, which is an absolute travesty, but it's just going to be crazy to me. This is a potential reunion spot maybe midway through the year if things aren't going incredibly well, but I do think this team would have looked better had they just not made any changes. As it stands now, I think this team is probably a middle-of-the-pack team. I think they're moving in an interesting direction. I'm just not super sold on the decision to bring in June. And then moving on to our third seed from the LEC at Worlds this year, and the only other team in the LEC to win a trophy in 2023, of course, winning the spring split, we have Mad Lions. It's certainly an interesting discussion to talk about what their offseason was, because unlike the two teams that we've talked about leading up to in this video, G2 and Fnatic, who either made no changes or made one very small change, and you're hoping it doesn't affect the team chemistry too much, Mad Lions went for a complete overhaul this offseason. They looked at their roster and they didn't think they had the same kind of upside that some of the other top teams had, and so what did they do? They went to the ERLs and they tried to really build something that could last them quite a long time. And as you can see from some of the grades that I'm giving on the screen, I kind of like this decision making. I don't know if it's going to work out in year one in particular, and obviously we've seen what happens in the LEC. If you're not productive instantly, you're basically exiled from the league, but you know, we'll end up seeing. I like the direction that they're going here. It's just going to be interesting to see if it can click into place. Let's talk about it. Their lineup in 2023 was looking like Chasey in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Niski in the mid lane, Karzi in the bot lane, and Hylissang at support. And their lineup in 2024 is looking like Merwin in the top lane. Also, if I say any of their names wrong, I really do apologize. I'm watching tape on them now, and, you know, a lot of times I have to watch it sped up because of covering all the leagues, and so just let me know. Don't scream at me, just let me know down in the comment section below if I'm pronouncing them wrong. You got Merwin in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Frescoe in the mid lane, Supa at AD carry, and Alvaro at support. Obviously, this is that knows each other well, that have played together quite a lot. Obviously, the bottom three members of this team that are being brought in from Movistar Riders, who just went to 5 in the EU Masters Finals against K-Corp, which is a pretty big accomplishment. And then Merwin in the top lane is somebody who does have a ton of experience being able to play at a decent level. This is not a, you know, inexperienced team. This is, you know, players that haven't exactly played in the LEC, but these are solid players that definitely deserve their call-ups. Now, I think some are definitely going to be a little bit of an easier transition than others in terms of the talent, but let's go ahead and talk about these players and, you know, the direction that Matt is going individually here, starting with the jungle, just because I think if you are going to keep one player on this team, it is no-brainer going to be Elyoya. There were a ton of rumors last year going into 2023 that Elyoya was gone, that he didn't want to be here anymore, that he really wanted to move on to a bigger organization, a team like G2 or a team like Fnatic. But he's sticking around with Mad for the long haul. We saw a lot of people talking about him getting contract ELO held or whatever, but obviously that wasn't the case. He ended up winning a title in 2023. Mad Lions was a lot better than I think people expected them to be in. I don't know what happened over the course of the year, but clearly Elyoya wants to be here. He wants to build around a lot of these young Spanish players, and, you know, it's definitely a fun opportunity for him. You know, a couple of years ago, he was the player that was in this situation, right? He was being brought in to a really good Mad Lions team, a championship-winning Mad Lions team as the jungler, and, you know, he needed to perform instantly, and so kind of being the veteran on this team now, you know, doing the same thing for a couple of other Movistar Riders players is really fun and really interesting. But again, he's going to get an A- grade. He's going to be tied for the highest grade that I'm giving any jungler. I think that's more than fair. There are 3 junglers that are getting that A- grade. We've already seen Yike. We've seen Elyoya. You can probably guess the third in terms of the players that are left, but I think all 3 of them are fantastic. In my opinion, Elyoya probably in the lead right now for the best jungler in the LEC because I think his carry potential is just a little bit higher. I think he's done it a little bit more consistently than the others. However, it is worth noting that Elyoya is coming off of his worst split, probably as a pro in the LEC in the summer split, where Matt obviously just had a ton of problems. There was more than just Elyoya struggling on that team. It really didn't feel like they were clicking in the same way, but it is worth noting that he was playing poor. He did play a lot better going into Worlds. He played better in the season finals, even though it still wasn't perfect. He just was able to beat Excel, which is nice, but, you know, there's definitely some improvement that you're kind of anticipating with this grade coming in here because he was not an A- player in summer, but I'm expecting that to happen. Like, that is anticipated from me. I think summer's going to be more of an outlier because we have seen what Elyoya can do at the highest of his level, and that's be a truly elite jungler. As for the rest of this team, that's where the question marks are going to come in. This is a team that was competing for titles last year, and it's definitely not a guarantee that that is going to be the case moving into 2024. We'll start with Merwin in the top lane. He's the one non-Movistar Riders player coming in here, and I actually really like this addition. Obviously, there were a ton of rumors that he was very highly prioritized by a couple of teams throughout this offseason. You know, Mad, Heretics, I think were, you know, definitely in the conversation. He had experience in the Heretics organization, so it's definitely a big get for them to get him. I'm not super sold that he's going to be an immediate impact at the same level as some of the other big ERL players that are coming up right now. That's why he's going to get a C+ grade. And generally speaking, I know not everybody who's going to be watching this video has watched all of my content, you know, when I do this over the past couple of years, but it's really hard for me to give anything higher than like a B or a B- for somebody who's never played in the LEC, because you just don't know, right? There are a lot of fantastic ERL players. There are a lot of fantastic LFL or LVP players, right? There are a lot of really good players that can perform really well versatile at that level, and then struggle a bit more when you transition them up. Even last year, we had a couple of those players that I thought were going to be pretty instant impacts, players like Jack Spectra, who just weren't able to make the same kind of impact that you would expect from that situation. It's really hard to give a player a really high grade if they haven't proven it at this level. That's why if you see a player get like a B or a B- grade as a rookie, like that's how you know I value them very highly. Merwin, I think, is going to be a good player, and he's somebody that, I'm considering this a change from Chasey, not a downgrade, even if I do think it might be a little bit worse in the short term. Chasey was surprisingly good for this team last year. He definitely struggled a bit in the regular season, but when they got to the best of fives, when they got to the playoffs, that's where he really started to play his best league. He was probably the biggest reason why this team won a trophy last year. He was phenomenal in that spring split playoff run. Obviously, the consistency just wasn't there, and he had a lot of really bad games down the stretch of the season for Mad, which is why he's only getting a B- grade. That's obviously bumped down a little bit because of the import status as well, but I think Merwin could come in and be, a very similar impact to him basically day one, and I think there's a pretty interesting shot for him to grow into being a better player, which is why I list this as a change. I really don't think this will be a major downgrade, even if I do have the grade a bit lower at the moment. And then the one, quote-unquote downgrade that I am going to list here is going to be the mid lane, and this has less to do with Frescoe, although it does have something to do with him, because I think he's probably the least interesting or least, surefire of these prospects, but also I think he's replacing a really important player towards what Mad Lions wanted to do. Nisqy was consistently underrated and undervalued by a lot of the community. Obviously, he isn't the most consistent, or, he's not a perfect player. He's not going to go out there and do everything that every fan wants him to do, but he does the little things just about as well as anybody in the league, and when Mad was clicking on all cylinders, when they were able to win, most of the time it was because Nisqy was playing really well. He was the, kind of the engine that made the rest of this team go. There are other really good players on this team. We can talk about how Karzi and Hilly definitely stepped it up down the stretch of the season, but they aren't able to carry nearly as easily if Nisqy's not putting them in good positions. And so I think this is a really big ask for Frescoe to come in and immediately kind of replace that, impact. It's a very different play style to what he has generally played. And, I am going to give him a C+ because he obviously was solid in the ERLs and at IU Masters in particular. He was really good at that tournament, but he's going to have to step into this team and basically be everything Nisqy was, just in a different way, and I just don't think that that's going to happen day one, which is why I'm going to list this as a downgrade at the moment. I just don't know if I trust him to ever get to what Nisqy was for this team, but it certainly is possible. I might be underrating him. I've underrated players, especially mid laners, coming in from the LVP in the past, and so it's certainly something to keep an eye out for, but Elyoya had a very interesting partnership with Nisqy that I think definitely made this team better. It's going to be interesting to see how Frescoe can come in and adapt to that and essentially be as good as he was in that role. And then you get to the part of the team that I'm the most excited about, and that's going to be the bot lane here, Supa and Alvaro. I'm pretty confident that these two are going to be very good at this level. Now, just as I've underrated mid laners coming into the league in the past, I have overrated bot laners quite a bit coming into the league in the past, or at least gotten them wrong. Like, I was low on Noah last year, and I was really high on Jack Spectra, and it just didn't end up working out in that way. Obviously, it ended up flipping. I would say before that, I was really good. My track record was really solid in that case. It just ended up not being perfect last year. Everything else was pretty good. Just the bot laners was a little bit questionable, but it's just hard not to watch Movistar Riders and be like, Supa and Alvaro are absolutely fantastic. I expect them to be able to come in and be a top 5 bot lane, maybe from day one. They really are that good. They are the bot lane in, the ERLs right now at EU Masters that really stood out to me, obviously with the exception of Kalista and Targamas, which we will get to later on in the video, but they're not going to be playing in the LEC. One of them will be, but the other's not old enough. And so Supa and Alvaro really were kind of the prize, I would say, this offseason in terms of young, inexperienced bot laners to bring into this team. And I think Mad's going to be very happy that they were able to get that. Karzi and Hilly were really good for this team down the stretch. Hylissang in particular, I think really showed back up and really showed why he was one of the best supports in the LEC for a really long time. It's big shoes to fill, especially for a player like Alvaro. I think Supa's definitely going to be a little bit more comfortable coming in and essentially just being given a lot of resources. That's what Mad does really well, is distribute resources, whether it's to Elyoya in the jungle, whether it's to Supa in the bot lane, Karzi last year. What they really do is pick a lane that they want to enable, and they enable them. Nisqy was moving around the map, and Elyoya's great at playing supportive junglers. They can do really whatever they want, and Supa's going to fit into that role, I think, really well. And I'm not as worried about him, I guess, is really the point I'm trying to make. It's really Alvaro that I think needs to come in and be that major difference maker from day one. I certainly think it's possible. They're both going to get B- grades at the moment, which does consider them changes. I certainly don't think they're downgrades because I think there's an opportunity for them to be more consistent and to have a bigger upside than what Carzzy and Hilly offered you on this team, which is why I think they wanted to move in this direction in the first place. But, it's a lot to ask to say to, be better than Hylissang day one if you're Alvaro who's never played in the LEC, or for Supa to come in and be better than Carzzy, who has been a staple LEC bot laner for quite a long time. It's just a bigger ask, but if any of these prospects were going to get B grades, it was going to be these two bot laners. These are the two best ERL prospects, in my opinion, coming up to the LEC this year. I have the highest expectations for them, and I really do think that they could dominate basically from moment one. It's just a lot to ask for them to guarantee do that. They're really, really good players, though, and I think Mad in general, when you're moving in this direction, when you're talking about the idea behind going to this, quote-unquote younger, higher upside roster than what you had last year, I like this idea. I don't think nearly enough teams take chances and take risks like this, and most of the time, they've worked out. Mad Lions was a team that did this in the past with a lot of young players like Elyoya, like Humanoid in the past, like Carzzy, and it's worked out for them. They've been able to kind of flip those players and turn them around for money and be really successful when they have the opportunity to get them all together. This could just be another iteration of that. I could definitely see, 2025 Mad Lions looking relatively similar and winning some trophies. I just don't know if it's going to be 2024. It's a pretty big ask. I do think there's enough talent on this team. Elyoya plus this bot lane could be a top 6 team. It really does have that kind of upside. It's just really difficult to predict that when you don't know what you're going to get out of the solo laners and when you don't know if the bot lane's going to transition nearly as neatly as you would like. But if they're going to show up and be, what Exakick and DOS were for SK last year, I think this team definitely could compete a lot quicker than people are expecting. And then moving on to our fourth and final Worlds team from 2023 here in the LEC, the number 4 seed. And it is kind of a surprise. Another team that's not making a ton of changes here. It's Team BDS. They finished 5th in the summer split, not making the playoffs, but they were able to get the job done in the season finals to get into that Worlds qualifying series. They made the most of it. They made the group stage. They honestly looked all right, considering what I think a lot of people expected them to do in that stage. But, this team definitely still has a lot of growth and improvement to do if they want to be true, world contenders. It's a team that can, potentially do relatively interestingly at the World Championships. I do think there is some growth to do. I do think it's worth noting that their offseason hasn't exactly been the most exciting. As you can see on the screen, 4 of the 5 members are returning, which generally I would say is good, especially after such a breakout year for so many of these players. But I think the one change is actually really negative for them. It's kind of similar to how I talked about Fnatic, although I think Fnatic's change is probably going to be a little bit less impactful because obviously Trimby was very important for what Fnatic did, but they have avenues to win through other areas, whereas BDS relied a lot on their bot lane being able to do well in the early game, and swapping that out isn't exactly going to be the most seamless of transitions, in my opinion, or that's what I'm expecting. So their lineup, obviously, last year was looking like Adam in the top lane, Sheo in the jungle, Nuke in the mid lane, Crownie at AD carry, and Labrav at support there. Running back 4 of the 5, only changing out Crownie in the AD carry spot for Ice, coming in from Zero Tenacity. If I had, a nickel for every single time a Zero Tenacity Korean AD carry came into the league and I didn't think they were going to do well, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. I just don't have a ton of faith in Ice. We'll get to that in a second, but let's talk about the rest of this team and why I actually have them valued relatively highly. I still think this team is actually going to be good next year. A lot of that is because I do think the LEC in general got significantly weaker, which is just kind of a trend. When you introduce a salary cap, typically speaking, you're going to have a weaker top end of the, region, of the division, and that is what happened here in the LEC, in my opinion. Only G2 really kind of standing tall coming in the offseason, feeling good. I wouldn't necessarily consider any other team to be dominant in the same way that G2 is going into the season, spoiler alert, but, BDS doing a good job to retain a roster that already was pretty solid last year. Starting with Adam in the top lane, it was a breakout year for Adam, in my opinion. I know a lot of people are going to look at Crownie and Labrav as the most important part of this team, and while I do think they're up there, and Crownie definitely deserves a lot of credit for how consistent he was before summer and before the end of the year, Adam was the best player on BDS in 2023, and they really did do a lot to rehabilitate his image. Obviously, people had really started to sour on him during his first stint with BDS a couple of years ago in 2021. I had never really fallen entirely off of the Adam train. I was very hyped when he came to BDS in the first place. I loved him on Fnatic. Obviously, he didn't exactly gel with that team very well, and you can argue that at the time he wasn't ready to be a player on a top team, and I would agree with that. I don't think it was his time, but from a mechanic standpoint, he's the #1 top laner in Europe. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate. From a pure mechanics 1v1 style standpoint, the way that he's able to play certain matchups, I think, just makes him basically uncounterable, right? He's obviously got a very unique and eclectic champion pool, which I do think contributes to him being relatively meta-proof. I think that you can put him in almost any meta, and he's going to be fine. He can play meta champions. I think that that's kind of the thing that gets lost is he doesn't have this tiny champion pool, and he's not this bannable player, right? There are a lot of players that get this tag of being, meta, I guess, anti-meta. A lot of mid laners get this when they play a lot of Akali or Sylas or these melee mids, but I think Adam fits into this description as well. Players that have a couple of really good champions and, maybe it's like, oh, their upside's going to be lower because you can ban out their really good champions and all of a sudden they're not as good. Well, I'm sorry, if you can't ban out every single one of their good champions, then they're not bannable. They're not a bannable player. That's what I've always talked about with players like Cream over in the LPL, where people will talk about him as this bannable player because he's got 4 or 5 really good mid laners, and if you take away those 4 or 5, then he's going to be worse. Well, you can't take away all 4 or 5 of those mid laners. It just isn't reasonable for you to be able to do that early on in a drafting phase, and Adam is the same way. Not only can he actually play meta picks relatively well, he's a good tank player. It's just not what he specializes in. He's got so many of these, like, pocket picks, right? The Olaf, the Garen, the Darius, all of these things, they all contribute to him being one of the more dangerous top laners in the league. He's going to get a B+ grade for me because I do think he deserves to be considered, a consistently great player. I think you could plug him in to any team in the LEC and you would be very happy with him there. He's one of the best top laners, a top 3 top laner in the LEC right now, and it's pretty contested. Top lane's actually a pretty deep role in the LEC right now, which is not what we were saying at the beginning of the year. So credit to Adam. I think he's very, very solid. And then you've got Sheo coming in. Talk about a player that just over-exceeded any expectations that I had for him. I was not super high on Sheo. I thought, obviously, BDS Academy was really fun to watch, but Adam and Crownie were such dominating presences on that team that I really didn't think Sheo was going to be able to adapt. It felt like he was kind of on a good team, not necessarily a great player, but he was awesome in the LEC last year in his first year for BDS. I don't think he's a superstar. It's why he's not getting a B+ grade. I don't think he's somebody that you could put into any sort of top tier team and have him dominate in the same way that he would for this BDS team. I do think he needs a little bit of, lane domination in order to be as successful as he is. He's not exactly a great player from behind, but generally speaking, that was just the jungle meta over the course of this year. But Sheo is really, really good, and I think they're going to be happy to be able to retain him here. A really consistent and solid player. And then you've got Nuke in the mid lane. I've been guilty of kind of underestimating Nuke over the course of this year. I was very low on him as a player, basically throughout all of his first stints, whether it was on Schalke, whether it was here on BDS before last year in 2022. I never really felt all that good about him as a player. It felt like he was consistently getting run over in lane, and while he was okay in the teamfight stage of the game, he just wasn't consistent enough for me to believe that he was going to be a long-term impact in the LEC as a mid laner. But then he had a big breakout here in 2023, and it certainly changes the perspective of him. There are a lot of mid laners that are going to get this B tag, players that I think on any given day can look really good and can gap, the player next to them, but I just don't know if I can consistently see them dominating the league. I still like Nuke. He's not a game-changing superstar. He's not Caps, right? He's not even a player like Larson, who I think game to game is going to be a little bit more consistent. He's just a really solid mid laner. You're never going to feel bad about having a player like Nuke as your starting mid because you can do a lot with him as a player. Still mostly a control mage player, but can kind of branch out into some of these more aggressive picks if he needs to. But, he's good. He's solid. I think that's where I've landed on Nuke. I'm not going to be surprised if he shows up and is really good in really important moments, but I'm also not going to be entirely surprised if he goes a couple of weeks without having a particularly good game. I think both of those things can be true. And then you're bringing Labrov back here. I actually like Labrov a lot. I've loved him over the course of his career. I actually doubted him a bit down the stretch. It felt like him and Crownie really fell off in the summer split, which was definitely a little bit disappointing. I think a lot of players really fell off in the summer split in the LEC. I felt like the talent level in the LEC really went down in the summer split, which is a very weird weird thing to say. It felt like a lot of teams really lost a lot of their synergies with the exception of, Excel and Fnatic, who really did start to step up. But I like Labrov a ton as a player. I think he's shown a ridiculous amount of mechanical upside with his time on Vitality, even early on in the year on BDS. I think it's very good to be able to retain him. Bringing him in last year was a major positive for a BDS team that needed kind of a solidifying presence for the rest of this team, and I do think he obviously offered that. I think Labrov is one of the most underrated supports in the LEC, a really, he's got a case to be made to be top 3, right? He's absolutely going to be in that discussion. I don't know if I'm going to put him there yet. It's certainly on my mind and in the conversation, but he absolutely has an argument to be made with how shallow the support pool has gotten in the LEC that he is a top 3 support. So being able to retain him is really good. And as you can see from the 4 players that they're retaining, I feel pretty good about BDS. These are solid players. Maybe not complete game changers outside of Adam, but they're good players. Like, you're happy to be starting Sheo, you're happy to be starting Nuke, you're happy to be starting Labrov. Where I do start to question this a bit is going from Crownie to Ice in the bot lane. And I just don't love this, right? Maybe I'm wrong, because I was wrong about Noah. I did not see Noah as this super high upside prospect coming in from Zero Tenacity in the middle of the year for Fnatic. And he came in and was really good. His mechanics were a lot better than I was giving him credit for. I just don't think, again, I'm seeing the same thing that I saw with Noah with Ice, and so I'm going to have him as a C+ right now. Do I think he could have a bigger impact than that year 1? Definitely, because I do think that the team around him is very much set up to propel bot lane in order to, kind of carry games. Crownie, I think, received a lot of that last year, but Crownie was awesome for most of the year. Again, very similar to what I've talked about with the rest of this BDS team. He did fall off even harder, I think, than everybody else in the second half of the year. He was really bad in Summer Split, and he was awful at Worlds. He was a big reason why this team quote-unquote underperformed. Probably shouldn't have gotten out of the play-in stage, if PSG didn't throw away that series at Worlds, but I still think that obviously he was so good for a majority of the year. I'm not going to sit there and just grade him based on the back half of the year. He was the best AD carry in the LEC for 2/3 of the regular season. He just couldn't quite finish it off. I understand why they would want to move in a different direction, but I don't see this as anything other than a downgrade. I think this is you making your team worse just for the sake of changing. I think you would be better off just running back the same 5 that overperformed so much this year. It's a very perplexing decision to me. Ice is a player that I've covered on this channel, obviously. For those of you who watch my LCK recaps, I've talked about Ice quite a bit on this channel when he was playing for Sandbox. I've just never really seen it in him. He always felt like a lackluster AD carry at that level. Watched some of the Zero Tenacity tape. Obviously, I'm going to have to get to a bit more of it. I do think he's very good, but that team felt very plug and play. It felt like that team was always going to be consistently strong. Basically, no matter who was playing in that bot lane role, they gave so many resources into the bot lane. And while Ice did a great job of capitalizing on those resources, I just don't know. Now, again, I see very similar things to what I saw with Noah from Ice, and Noah did really well, and so if Ice can come in and be a top 4, top 5 AD carry, this team is probably going to be a top 2, top 3 team in the league. There really is that kind of upside, especially if the consistency carries over. If you can get some, good performances out of these players that know what to do when they're playing with each other, then you're in the clear. You're in a really good spot. It's all going to be up to Ice, though. I really do think we know what we're getting out of the rest of this team. If Adam can stay a really strong and stable top laner, if Sheo, Nuke, Labrov can be good players, then you need Ice to step up. And if that's the case, again, they're probably going to be a top 4 team. And if that's not the case, they might be looking at a new AD carry again as we move into the second half of the year. Now we're moving out of the Worlds teams, and we're moving into the teams that just barely missed it. Season Finals participators, but not teams that ended up making it to the World Championships, and that's starting with one of our summer finalists being Excel. And I think a lot of people were really surprised, me included, to not see this team go to Worlds. They were looking so good. By the end of the summer split, things really seemed to have started to click for this team. A lot got better as the year went on. It felt like a lot of the roster changes they made were just better for mental overall, and, obviously they moved in a positive direction. They certainly made some changes this offseason. I think some of them are interesting. I certainly do not think that they are going to make them better at the moment, but there is an opportunity for this team to be better by the end of the year if, some of the development ends up going according to plan. Let's talk about it. Their lineup last year was obviously Odoamne in the top lane, Peach in the jungle, Abadage in the mid lane, Patrick at AD carry, and Limit at support. And then in 2024, their lineup is reportedly looking like Odoamne in the top lane, Peach in the jungle, Jackie's in the mid lane, Patrick at AD carry, and Ignar at support. So a couple of opposite types of changes for this team here. You obviously have youth coming in the mid lane and experience coming in the support position, retaining a couple of these members, I think there's reason to be optimistic, especially with some of the members that you were able to keep, because I do think the players that you kept were the best players on the team last year and probably the most important towards what you're doing in the future, and that obviously starts with Odoamne in the top lane, who was awesome for this team down the stretch. We've been talking about so many players who were worse in summer, who just didn't quite have the same impact on the game that they were at the beginning of the year in the summer split, but Odoamne was the opposite of that. He was better in the summer split than he was at any point. It really, but Odo was really good in the winter split, even when Excel was struggling, but, in the spring split, it felt like he was just as much of a victim of Excel's playstyle and everything going wrong for this team as anybody else was on Excel, and it just felt like it wasn't going to be his year. But when things started to click for this team, when they started to get a little bit more clinical with how they played out some of these games, Odo, I think, really was the player who kind of got back on track for them. And I think we all kind of expected that to be a possibility for him. Obviously, it's Odoamne. This is not some generic top lane player. This has been one of the best top laners in the LEC for many, many years now. And coming over to Excel, he was one of the big reasons why I had so much confidence and faith in this team in the preseason last year, is because I was like, Odo's like the best top laner in the league, and the rest of this team is really talented as well. Obviously, things did not end up working out for them at the beginning of the year, but retaining Odo is a must for this team. He is the most important player. He is the player you need to be building around on Excel for the rest of this year, and so really, really like that change, obviously, to bring him back. He's also going to get a B+ grade, by the way. Like I said, top lane is very deep right now. You could make an argument that Odo's not even a top 3 top laner in terms of the performances he put out last year, and that's just because top lane is super good at the top. It's pretty deep as well. It's a very, very tough role to be able to break through, but Odo is a very solid player, and he's definitely making an argument to be a top 3 top laner, which is huge in this current meta. And then you've still got Peach in the jungle. You imported him at the end of the year last year. He was playing in the ERLs, obviously, but most notably for DRX Challengers back in the day. I like Peach. I think he's a really, really interesting player. I don't think he's a star. I don't think he ever will be a star. It's why he's going to get a B- grade from me. This would probably be a B if he wasn't an import. I do think that matters in Peach's case because this team is using both of its import slots at the current moment, but Peach is good enough to justify that import slot. Him being a B- player just essentially means that he's a solid starter. He's somebody that you feel good about, like you're not going to freak out about him being your starting jungler. I'm just not blown away by him. He seems to be pretty consistent. He never really took over games in the same way that you would see some of the other top junglers at this level take over games, but he didn't really need to. A lot of time last year, it was top lane that was really dominating early, and you could kind of count on that to be a power point of the map that you'd be able to play through, and then Patrick doing really well in a lot of these team fights to be able to clean up for that. And Peach just needed to facilitate that. He's definitely more of a facilitator, but that's what they were looking for in that jungle role. It's why they brought in Xerxes to begin with at the beginning of the year, is because they were looking for someone that could be more of a team player in that spot, and I think Peach fills that role well. Again, I don't think he's a superstar. I don't think he's someone that's pushing this team over the edge, over the limit, but I think he's good enough for you to be able to win with him, and I think unfortunately, I'm kind of in a similar spot now with Patrick. It feels like I've gone on the roller coaster with Patrick, where at the beginning of his career, I was like, he's good, but is he really as good as everybody's hyping him up to be? And then once he came over to Excel, the first year, especially on Excel, I'm like, oh my god, this guy's ridiculously talented. His mechanics are just better than everybody else's in the region, and he has the potential to be like the number 180 carry for a long time. And he really was performing like that, even on Excel teams that just were not very good. It felt like he was always individually doing everything he needed to do. He was never the most aggressive AD carry. That was always the big kind of knock on him as a player, was that he wasn't going to take matters into his own hands. He was going to be a little bit more team dependent than other AD carries, but when he was given opportunities to carry games, he did more with those resources than any other AD carry in the league. That's how good Patrick was. I'm a little bit lower on him now. I still think he's a very good AD carry, and honestly, in the right circumstance, I do think he can win games, but I'm starting to understand why people are so down on him. I do think it's pretty lazy to say, oh, Patrick hasn't been a part of winning teams, and so he must not be a winning player. I think that's a pretty lazy way to analyze his career, because I do think that obviously the situation has significantly more nuance than that, and you're essentially just removing the nuance by making that statement. But I do think there is a reason that Patrick has never really been the kind of AD carry that has taken over the league, a first-team All-Pro guy, even on losing teams, and that's because I think mentality-wise, it's just never going to be him. He's an AD carry that you can rely on in some games to just dominate, and honestly, he doesn't doesn't really have a lot of bad games. He's never really going to lose you games, but if he's your best player like he was for Excel for a very long time, it's just kind of difficult to win games off of the back of him because he doesn't necessarily put himself in the most dominating of positions. Now, what really worked down the stretch for Excel, and the reason that Patrick really started to break out at the end of the year last year again, is because they started playing through other lanes. He is the optimal weak side bot laner. Like, he is perfect for that role, and I do think it's possible for them to go to that role again this year if they want to play a lot more towards top side like they did at the end of the year. I like Patrick a lot, but he's just not this game-breaking presence. He's amidst the cluster of AD carries in the LEC right now that are B tier, as you can notice from a lot of the rankings that we've already given, and, you know, spoiler alert for a lot of the rankings that will come up. B is a very common grade for AD carries, and Patrick's definitely in that cluster. He can be just as good as any other AD carry, and he can also have a lot less of an impact than other AD carries, you know, on any given game. He's just kind of volatile in that regard, just not in the way that you would typically associate with volatile play. And then you've got the two new players on this team. Let's talk about Ignar first, because obviously he's the veteran coming in here to play support. I have this listed as a change from Limit, because I think Limit was good, but if you're looking at what Ignar offered in summer of last year for energy, if you're just comparing Limit to Summer Ignar, this is an upgrade for Excel. This is them getting better at this position. It's just hard for me to predict that. That's why Ignar only gets a B- grade. He was significantly better than being a B- player last year in the LCS. The problem is that that was a huge re-breakout for Ignar. He was really, really bad the last 2 years before that. Obviously, the beginning of the year with Dignitas ended up not going according to plan for a lot of different reasons, but last year on Immortals was really, really miserable. It just didn't feel like he was the player that he was, you know, on FlyQuest or on Misfits back in the day. It felt like a lot of that confidence that he had generated had kind of gone, and the aggressive Ignar that we had known wasn't there anymore. But Summer really showed us a lot of glimpses that that guy can be back. And so, yes, I have this listed as a change because it's really hard to predict that Ignar is just going to perform like that from here on out, because he wasn't like that the last 2 years. It really felt like the decline was on for him. However, if he does play like Summer Ignar from 2023, he's going to be better than Limit. And this is actually going to be a really interesting bot lane, because you can leave Patrick a little bit on an island. He does very good in those 1v2s in the bot lane where he can just survive, farm up, and be really strong in team fights. And you can allow Ignar to be that really aggressive playmaker that he really was known for at the beginning of his career. I do think that's a possibility. It's just hard for me to predict that that's definitely what's going to happen with a player who really just has not shown any level of consistency over the past few years of his career. I like this addition. I like this punt, especially if you weren't able to get other options, but I don't know if I necessarily expect him to be this big breakout star player. And I don't know, I could see a world in which Patrick and Ignar also don't synergize well together, because Ignar wants to leave lane and Patrick, you know, isn't necessarily the AD carry that wants to, like, you know, dominate early on in games. He doesn't want to play super aggro very quickly, and Ignar kind of does. And so I could see opportunities for this bot lane to not work as well, but, you know, I could also see it working if the playstyles do end up meshing. So he's going to be listed as a change for now, even if I don't love the move. And then it's also going to be a change in the mid lane, because this is a change in mentality for how you want to do this. You are taking a punt on a Czech player who has almost no experience at any top level. He's been playing in the Czech league, and while he's dominated the Czech league, and Tropic was really good this past year, I just don't know if that's kind of the pathway, the ladder climbing line that you could expect to see him immediately dominate in the LEC. I have him as a C+ grade. I think that is pretty generous for what he has offered. I do think he's an interesting prospect, which is why he's a C+ player. He's certainly not a C+ graded asset right now, right? Like, he's somebody who is going to have to grow into being a C+ asset. But by the end of the year, could he be a B player for this team? Absolutely. I think that, you know, he could be better than Abadaga if everything goes well, if, you know, some of that growth and development does happen early. But, you know, as it is right now, when you're just inserting Jackie's into this lineup, I think there's a strong argument to be made that Jackie's is the weakest player at the moment in the LEC, like on a roster right now. He just has shown very little to be an LEC starting mid laner in a sea of players that are really, really talented at those positions. And so it's definitely going to be a question mark. If he can come in and be better than I'm anticipating him being, I think that could be a positive. But a lot of the reason that I'm worried about Excel's performance this year, and why I really don't like the direction that this team went is in the offseason, is because I just don't really think Jackie's is going to be good in 2024. I think it's going to take a little bit more time for this 19-year-old that's really never even played at Tier 2. Like, obviously, yes, you know, Tier 2 does include the Czech League, it does include Hit Point Masters, but there's a difference between playing for the playing in the LFL and playing in the LVP and playing in Hit Point Masters. It's not the same. And I think, it might be a little bit of a learning curve for Jackies. Even the Polish league that, I've criticized so much for players like Noah and Ice being like, yeah, they dominated that, but, can you make that transition to the LEC? Like, even the Polish league is a little bit more competitive than what, typically the Czech league has shown off. And it's just going to be interesting to see if Jackies can, make that transition look a little bit easier. I think I'm expecting this team to be kind of mediocre, if we're being honest. I think grade-wise, you can kind of see why. I love Odo. I think Patrick is a really solid player, but do you have the pieces around them to be able to make another run like you did last year, to be able to be a pseudo-Worlds team? I just don't think so. I think Peach is fine, but I don't think Peach is the kind of player that can be your third best player if you want to make Worlds. And Ignar's, you're kind of hoping that you can get the 2023 version of him rather than anything else, and that's a lot of hope. You're hoping that Jackies can quickly develop into being an interesting mid laner. It's just a lot of things that have to go right for this team. I don't think it's an awful offseason. That's why none of these are considered downgrades, because I think in a vacuum, going from Limit to Ignar and going from Abadaga to Jackies, can work if things end up working out. They're not awful moves. I just don't think it's going to show a lot of fruit in 2024. I've talked about a team like Mad Lions, not necessarily expecting a lot of results this year. I think Excel's probably in a similar spot, and I think some of these pickups are going to be more for the future, Jackies in particular, than they are this year in particular. And now moving on to our final team to compete in the season finale tournament, the final top 6 team in the LEC in 2023, and that is SK Gaming. And not a major offseason for them, but one that I think definitely moves them in a more interesting direction. I think this team has constantly felt like the middle child of the LEC, where they have talent, they have players that are interesting, but it never really feels like enough for them to ever compete for a world spot, and so it doesn't really ever feel interesting to talk about them. They're not bad enough where it feels like they should be completely, resetting and starting over and moving on to different players, but they're certainly not good enough in order to dominate. However, I do want to say that I continue to like the minor moves that this organization has made over the past few years. I really liked their roster last year. I loved the addition of Marcoon and Irrelevant. I thought that they were really good players, and Exakick and DOS obviously turned out to be fantastic. And I think moving into 2024, you're hoping you can take some of those hits and transition them into a more complete roster by adding a couple more players, a couple more experienced players into this roster. So let's talk about it. Obviously, their lineup last year was looking like Irrelevant in the top lane, Marcoon in the jungle, Certus in mid lane, Exakick at AD carry, and DOS at support. And their lineup in 2024 is looking like Irrelevant in the top lane, Isma in the jungle, Niski in the mid lane, Exakick at AD carry, and DOS at support. So you're changing out your jungle mid here, and I think that's often a pretty risky thing to do, especially because Marcoon was so good for this team last year. He's certainly a positive asset in general when you're looking at the LEC. So, moving on from him and moving to a less experienced jungler, somebody who, again, doesn't have LEC experience in Isma, it's certainly going to be a question mark. But if you're going to keep 3 stable players on this team, I think you probably pick the 3 right ones. We'll start with Irrelevant in the top lane. I've really liked him ever since he's joined the LEC, ever since the Misfit days. And I think he's essentially just become exactly what we thought he was going to be, which is this incredibly solid weak side top laner. He is the pinnacle of, you put him on an island, he's going to do just fine. He's certainly not going to lose you anything. He can carry games, he just isn't really given a lot of resources very often, and so it's not really a part of his game plan in terms of how he has played out a lot of his career up until this point. He is a very good top laner, somebody you're going to be very happy to start. He's going to get a B grade for me. He's somebody who, again, you're happy to have on the team. Isn't a game breaker, isn't somebody who I think could become a game breaker. I just don't really see that as a trajectory for him. I think some people are a little bit higher on him than I am. Some people are lower on him than I am. I think I'm somewhere in the middle, where I'm happy that he's still starting here in the LEC. I think he's more than deserving of that spot, but he's not a complete game changer for me. He's not somebody who I think is going to push this team over the top if they do want to try and fight to get into that top 4. The bot lane, however, in my opinion, is that. I do think you definitely make the argument that Exakick and DOS are the best part of this team. They certainly were in 2023. Exakick, in particular, really emerged as a potential superstar in the bot lane, and I think that that's major for this team. I debated on giving him a higher grade than B. I think for now, B is fair. He was a little bit more rough down the stretch. Again, very similar to what we've been talking about for so many of the LEC players, is just the back half of 2023 not being nearly as consistent for them, but I still like Exakick a lot. I think if his development can continue, there were times where he was a top 1, top 2 bot laner in the LEC last year. That's what I was saying after the winter split. I put him first team All-Pro in my winter split All-Pro rankings, and so, there were definitely splits and moments where Exakick showed what he could be at the highest of levels, and if he can continue to grow on that, if that version of him can be there all the time, like, that's SK's path upwards. They've been waiting for a superstar level player. They've been trying to take these shots on young players in the ERLs to try and see if they can develop them into players that can contribute at this level, and it feels like they finally have hit with a player in Exakick. That is very, very exciting to have here. Obviously, you're hoping you can build the roster around him that can enable him, but if this team does overperform expectations this year, which I certainly don't think is out of the realm of possibility, it's probably because Exakick turns into that superstar AD carry that we're all kind of hoping he can be. And then you've got Doss as his bot lane partner here. He's going to get a B- grade for me. It's a little bit lower than Exakick. I feel like Doss is a little bit more volatile as a player, but honestly, in terms of upside, there were moments last year where he was better than Exakick. This bot lane in general, I think, overperformed. I was low on Doss. I think a lot of analysts were low on Doss. He was the support that I was not really interested in going into 2023, and that did not turn out to be true. He was a very, very good player for SK. Certainly an LEC starting, support. He is definitely someone that deserves to be considered, in this run-back situation, especially because it feels like him and Exakick have a very good relationship. They came up from LDLC together, and obviously, Exakick was kind of the prize. Doss was, brought along for the ride. I think that was probably an Exakick decision, and it's turned out to be very, very good. These two play off of each other well. I don't think Doss would be nearly as valuable without Exakick, which is why he is going to get a little bit of a lower grade, but he's a starting caliber support. Even if you were to put him on a different team, I still think he could function at a relatively good level. If you're going to bring back two players, these were the two that you had to bring back. Exakick in particular, I think if you really like the synergy that you can form between these two, then having them stay together as a pair is definitely, a fine idea, but, Exakick was a must-keep here, and Doss is definitely a part of that package, and then, of course, Irrelevant is solid, but you're switching out your jungle mid. This certainly does raise some question marks, because it's never going to be an easy situation to switch out, what was a very core part of the meta last year. This team really did play through Marcoon quite a bit. And so to go from him to Isma in the jungle position is certainly going to be a little bit of a move, but Isma's really good. I know I talked really highly about the Movistar Riders team from last year, but that's because they were really good, and those of you who didn't watch, EU Masters, I think missed out on just how talented a lot of these players are. Isma was a big prize this offseason, and SK ended up winning that. This is another player that I could see turning into like a really high-value jungle prospect in just a year. If we're looking at him with the same trajectory as a player like Exakick, at the end of next year, I'm not going to be surprised at all. Like, this is a great addition. I'm going to give him that B- grade, and I'm going to give him the change from Marcoon. I really like Marcoon. I think he is a really strong jungler at the LEC level, somebody who can make an impact and a difference regularly in games, and I think Isma could come in and be what he is year one, which is massive. Different playstyles. I think Marcoon is definitely more of a facilitator than Isma is, but a big reason why they were able to bring in, an upgrade in the mid lane that they ended up getting was because they wanted to play with Isma. I think that that's a really big testament and a positive to how good he can be. Now, I do want to say, he's not Supa and Alvaro. I think they were definitely the carries of that Movistar Riders team. Isma did a great job of facilitating that playstyle, but there is a chance that Isma comes in and is a little bit closer to Tynex than he is to, like, Elyoya in terms of being able to be promoted immediately from a top ERL team and actually be able to make an impact early on. I could see that definitely being a possibility. He is more volatile, in my opinion, as a prospect. I very narrowly gave him a C+ grade. Honestly, I probably should give him a C+ grade, but I'm a little bit biased towards him. I think he's a really, really interesting player. He's just somewhere in that range. If you want to give him a C+, if you want to give him a B-, he's kind of on the fringe, the edge of both of those, but I think he'll be a solid starter, and I think especially because it feels like he has a great support system around him to do that. A very stable top side, a very good bot side, and a super proactive mid laner here. They're bringing in Niski from Mad Lions to play in the mid lane. This is an upgrade. I know people are low on Niski, but I've been high on Niski for his entire career. I called him an upgrade when he was taking over for Nemesis on Fnatic a couple of years ago. I called him an upgrade when he joined Mad Lions. Obviously, the Reeker situation ended up not working out, but Niski has been nothing but fantastic for that team. Again, very similar story. Summer was not his best showing. Summer in general was really bad for Mad Lions, and Niski was definitely a part of that. He was miserable, especially down the stretch, but, you know, for a majority of 2023, he was the best mid laner in the region, maybe outside of Caps, and that's a really, really big testament. Don't forget, he was also MVP last year in 2022 as well, and so a two-time MVP, somebody that you can really look at to be consistent for your team, and with a playstyle that wants to get the rest of his team ahead, doesn't really need a ridiculous amount of resources because his shove and roam mentality is very, you know, good for making sure your jungler feels comfortable or for getting your bot lane very, very fed. There's just a lot to like about Niski here, and I think he fits exactly what you're building with SK very, very well. You're lucky to be able to land him. Now, he is still only going to get a B grade from me because, again, the end of 2023 was so miserable, but, you know, for most of 2023 and in 2022, he was a B+, like A- kind of mid laner for Mad Lions, and if that's the kind of player that you're getting here for SK Gaming, I mean, Worlds really is the ceiling here for this team. I know people don't necessarily, you know, believe that, and I haven't really heard a lot of talk about this, but you want a Dark Horse team for 2024? It absolutely could be SK Gaming. I really like the way that they're constructed. They may not have the most talent of any team in the league. There are teams that are going to be more talented across the board when you just compare positions, but I think when you look at the synergies between these players, the play styles that they offer, I really like the way this team is constructed. I think the SK, you know, management and ownership team has done a really good job of continuously finding good players and developing them well over the past couple of years, and I think this could be the year that it does culminate. They could just be a middle-tier team, like I talked about, with what they've been, but if Exakick and Niski and Isma can really explode and be this dynamic carry trio for them, which is certainly not out of the realm of possibility, this could be one of the more fun teams in the LEC. Now that we've covered the 6 teams that made the season finale, though, we get to move on into, I guess, the bottom 4, if you will, the 4 teams that were just eliminated after Summer Split. This is going to be an order of championship points. It's not particularly important what order these go in. I'm just going to do it based off of that as kind of like a whole year overview, but I guess coming in at number 7 was Koi, or I guess now, again, known as Rogue. Koi has split. Ibai is out, and Rogue is back. Infinite Reality owns this spot once again fully, and so they're going by Rogue. Rogue has partnered up again, and I think this is a good idea. I mean, if Koi's going to be out, Rogue is a recognizable brand name that you can play off of. At least it's something. Also, Rogue has a legacy in the LEC, being champions at one point, so there's at least something to play off of there. But again, all of it is going to depend on how good this team actually is. They were very, very lackluster last year, if we're being entirely honest. We saw just about the worst case scenario, I think, for what we could expect from the roster that they ended up putting together, which is not even making top 6, which is certainly not what you wanted to see, but I think there's a lot of reason to believe that 2024 will be better for them. So let's talk about it. Their lineup last year was obviously Shigenda in the top lane, Maorang in the jungle, Larson in the mid lane, Comp at AD carry, and Advienne at support, at least by the end of the year. And their lineup in 2024 is looking like Shigenda in the top lane, Marcoon in the jungle, Larson in the mid lane, Comp at AD carry, and Zoelis at support. Really like this roster. I actually think they moved in a really good direction this offseason. I think they continue to want to be competitive, and I honestly compare this offseason pretty similarly to what teams like SK have been doing, where it's, you obviously want to be able to compete. You're putting together a group of good pieces and hoping that, you know, if you can put enough good pieces together, they can become great as a unit. And I like that idea. I think you're taking a couple of risks with this roster as well in a good way, where I think you have a lot of upside if things end up going right. And I think there's reason to be optimistic that Rogue could, again, be a top 4 team. I know that I'm saying that as kind of the benchmark, but again, that's kind of where you want to hit. If you can be a top 4 team, I think you're going to be pretty happy with your season in the LEC this year with how budgets have been cut across the board. So let's talk about the members that are staying. First and foremost, I'm going to go out of order a bit this time because I think it would be wrong to start with anybody except for Larson in terms of the discussion surrounding Rogue. He was the best player on Koi last year, and it wasn't particularly close. Shigenda did a lot better down the stretch of the year. It really felt like he was coming on and figuring stuff out in the top lane, but this team is built around Larson. He is the franchise player for Rogue here, and I think that being able to retain him and having him be such a core piece to this team is so major. There was obviously a ton of rumors that Larson was going to leave, that he wanted to go to a team like SK or Vitality or, you know, another team that was going to be surrounding him with better talent, because the rumor was that, you know, there was going to be no money for this Rogue team, but obviously everybody cutting budgets. There wasn't really a lot of money for any teams, which means a lot of players got signed for cheaper, and so, you know, Rogue was actually able to keep a good majority of this roster, and that's a major positive. Larssen is one of the few mid laners in the region that you're going to see getting a B+ grade. In fact, he's the only one. Caps got an A, Larssen got a B+. That's the extent of like your upper tier mid laners right now in terms of consistency. Remember, B+ means consistently good starter. B is still good. You're still going to have the same kinds of good performances from a B player. It just means you're not going to get it from game to game in the same way. Larssen's going to give you what you expect to get from him every single game. He's not this dynamic, you know, destroy lane and carry games kind of player, but he's the most consistent late game team fighter that Europe has to offer, especially out of the mid lane position. He's really, really easy to win with because he essentially requires no resources to be incredibly useful. If you surround him with carry-oriented players, he is just going to make them look better. And he still can carry late-game team fights. He's just a valuable player. I've kind of looked down on Larssen before, or at least been, I guess, lower on Larssen before in previous years, but I honestly don't think I was lower on Larssen. I think I was just higher on other mid laners, talking about the impact that they were able to have. And I think mid lane has just been super volatile in the LEC, and so Larssen has inevitably climbed back up the rankings. He's crazy consistent, and he's a big positive for this team. You're also keeping your top and your bot laner here. Shigenda was probably this team's second best player across 2023. He was really solid. There were multiple moments where he was winning top lane matchups that he really shouldn't have been. He wasn't given a ton of priority in draft, and yet he was still doing really, really well. And I think that's a good reason to bring him back. I think Shigenda is a very talented player. We've known that since the Vitality days. Like, we've known that he is incredibly mechanically skillful. It's all been about putting it together and being consistent about it. And it felt like that was a kind of the step that he was moving towards in 2023. I think 2024 will be a good year. And I think the solo lanes are definitely the big standout positive part for Rogue. He's only going to get a B because he hasn't proven that he can consistently be a top, 3 or top 4 top laner in the league every single game and every single split, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility for him to get there this year, like even by the end of winter split, right? He's right on the cusp. He's a very, very solid player and one that Rogue is happy to have. And then you're bringing Comp back as well. Comp has obviously gone through quite an arc in his career. He was somebody who I was ready to completely give up on by the time he left Vitality. I really felt like he was going to be, just a mediocre at best AD carry at the LEC level, but he had that breakout year in 2022 for this Rogue team where he genuinely was the best AD carry in Europe. And I don't think a lot of people saw that coming, but we were all hoping to see a repeat of that in 2023, and it just didn't happen. There were some good moments, but he kind of returned to his pre-2022 form last year, and that's definitely concerning. He's still going to stay at a B grade for me, because I think it would be disrespectful to put him lower than that, but, he's on thin ice. He's like the low end of B right now, because he was not a B grade player last year. He was a big reason why this Koi team ended up underperforming expectations. Obviously, Malrang ended up getting out of meta. They could not find any sort of consistent answer at the support position, especially once Trimby was gone. But, Comp was not good. Comp was losing them a lot of games. I talked about this extensively in my weekly reviews last year for Koi. Koi would win games if Comp played well, and if Comp played poorly, they would lose games. That's how important he was, and they ended up not being all that good last year, and I think a lot of that was him just not stepping up and being the guy they needed him to be. If he can get back to that 2022 form in 2024, that's a really strong core you have. He was amazing in 2022, but again, if he's going to be more of that mediocre level AD carry, like this below average AD carry that he was last year, that's a concern because they are kind of relying on him in terms of how they built this team. Larssen and Shigenda do a lot to help with that, and I do think you have the pieces around him now that should hopefully be able to propagate him, but they need him to be consistent in some way, shape, or form, and he just hasn't been. But let's talk about the changes on this team. Starting in the jungle, you're going from Malrang to Marcoon, basically the exact opposite playstyles, and I have this listed as a change, but in all honesty, this is kind of an upgrade. It's listed as a change because Malrang actually was pretty okay last year, even after the meta changed. He really wasn't this disaster that I think everybody wanted to make him out to be. He was not very good in summer, but like we've talked about, there are a lot of players that I think really struggled in the summer split for one reason or another, and I think Malrang's problems ended up getting a little bit overstated down the stretch. He was really good at the beginning of 2023 when Koi was still performing well in the winter split, but Marcoon is just significantly more consistent than Malrang is. There really isn't a lot of debate up for that. I love Marcoon. I think he's been a major asset on every single team he's played for, whether it's Excel or SK. He's been very good for both of these teams, and he's made both of them better. I would be shocked if he didn't do the same thing here on Rogue. He's not a superstar, and you might worry a bit about the composition of this team, where you have a lot of good players, and you don't really have a lot of players that want a ton of resources, that want to take over the game, right? Marcoon's really not that guy. Larssen is certainly not that guy. And if they're going to be your most consistent players, especially out of the mid-jungle positions, then you're just kind of hoping that one of them can take that step up to being this big resource-heavy player, but that's really your only flaw, because in terms of consistency, Marcoon and Larson are both very good. Now, there's a reason that Marcoon's not a B+, and while he is consistent, he just doesn't have the same high-level performances as some of the other B+ junglers. He's just a very good starter. I would have felt really bad if he didn't have a starting spot in the LEC this year. I'm glad Rogue was able to pick him up, and I think he'll fit in really well with the construction of this team, so long as him and Larson can, you know, work out who wants to get a lot of the early game resources. And then you've got Zoelis in the support position. I like this pickup. It's why I'm listing it as a change. In fact, again, this is another case where you could argue that this is an upgrade immediately. Zoelis was, you know, very good for LDLC, which is surprising because that team was really bad. I went into that tape expecting him to be pretty mediocre, to have to look for upside plays, to have to be like, okay, let's look at the mechanics, because clearly, like, he's probably not going to look good if he's playing for a bad LFL team as a support, right? It's just really hard to look good when you're playing for a bad team as a support. It's very difficult to kind of, you know, overperform your team's expectations. But Zoelis actually made a ton of really, really fun plays, and I could see why he was super prioritized this offseason. I think this is a really good pickup for Rogue, and I think he could turn into a really interesting player. For context, I actually think his tape for a much, much worse team was better than Doss's last year, coming out of the ERLs and, you know, coming out of LDLC in general. And so, you know, I think there's an opportunity for Comp to get back on track here and get back to that 2022 form if Zoelis is, you know, a really good support. I think there's a chance for him to be a top 5 kind of guy. He's only going to get a C+ right now because, again, it's just like super limited sample size, and you do have to kind of look for that upside if you're watching the tape, because the team itself just wasn't very good in summer. But Zoelis has that upside. Like, it's absolutely there. You can see it very, very clearly. And so I'm happy they were able to pick him up. But again, if him and Comp don't get on the same page, or if Zoelis isn't as ready, which is totally possible, like, it's totally possible for him to just not be as good in winter, I think this bot lane could potentially struggle again. And, you know, when you look at the top side of the map, I love Shigenda, and I think he's probably the best chance that you have for, like, a carry dominant oriented player. But Marcoon and Larson aren't going to be able to drag a team that has a bad bot lane across the finish line. They're just going to make a good bot lane look like a great bot lane, if that does end up being the case. Obviously, there are a lot of pieces on this team that I think could make the transition and the mid-game, I guess, of their season a lot smoother, but there are a lot of opportunities for this team to fumble. I think a lot of responsibility is on Comp in particular, and if he can step up, if he can get back into that form, they're going to be fine, but their additions are really solid. Marcoon's a good player, and Zoelis is a really interesting prospect. I think I like their offseason, especially considering just how hectic it was outside of any of the actual on-Rift decisions that they made. And now moving on to a team that I think a lot of people are really excited to hear talked about in this video. It's certainly an interesting one. It's not quite the one that I think everybody's waiting for, which we will get to very, very shortly, but still a super team last year that did not end up working out. Of course, we're talking about Team Vitality and the offseason that they ended up having. It was a rough 2023 for them. This team came into this year with ridiculous expectations. They thought they would be a top 1, top 2 team in the region, and as you can see from the summer record alone, 1-8, last place in the final split of the season. Didn't even qualify for the season finals because of how poorly they performed in that final split, even though they did make top 3 in the spring split. Just a disappointing year in general for Vitality, especially because of the amount of money and intrigue they were able to establish with the roster that they put together. Things obviously just couldn't click, and there are a lot of reasons for it. We'll talk about why I think, you know, things ended up not going their way and the adjustments that they're making going into 2024, whether I like the new direction they're going in. Spoiler alert, it's really not all that different of a direction. I think the idea of a super team in the LEC has just kind of adapted and evolved with the salary cap now. We see some teams and some players really taking major pay cuts to stay together. But for the most part, you're going to need to get a couple of established players alongside a couple of up-and-coming new players to really establish a new super team, kind of similar to what G2 did last year. So I think Vitality is definitely still going for it with this roster, and we'll talk about why I actually think this might be better for them than anything they had in 2023. Their lineup last year was obviously Photon, Bo, Perks, Upset, and Kaiser, and their lineup in 2024 is Photon in the top lane, Douglas in the jungle, VTO in the mid lane, Karzi at AD carry, and Hillisang at support. Only one remaining member from the 2023 team, and it is Photon on the top side of the map, and this was a no-brainer. If you're going to keep one member of this team from last year, it absolutely should be Photon. Photon was phenomenal for Vitality. He was my MVP in the winter split at the beginning of the year. I thought he was the most important and valuable player to his team, even if Vitality ended up not being as good as people thought they would be in that split. And he continued his dominance really all throughout the year. As I've said a lot of times in this video already, summer wasn't exactly, I think, what he was anticipating in terms of the dominance, but Vitality just struggled across the board in the summer split. So many underperformances from basically every player. I'm not going to sit there and say that that's what I expect from Photon over the next year. There was a really strong argument to be made that he was the best top laner in the LEC for most of the year. Broken Blade, I think, overcame him towards the back half of the year, overtook him over the back half of the year, but Photon was phenomenal, and I think there's really a lot of reason to believe that that's going to continue. His mechanical prowess is one of one in the LEC in terms of top laners. Now, Adam, I think, is the other player that you could consider in that range, but they're very different types of players. Photon's going to be able to do it in a much more structured way, where Adam really likes the chaos. He likes the fights. He likes the skirmishes. It's different styles, but Photon and Adam are both incredibly mechanically talented. Photon, at the very least, has to be considered in that category, which is why he's getting that B+ tag. Again, there are 4 top laners in the LEC that have B+ tags or above, which is crazy. I never thought we'd get to the day where top lane feels like the deepest position at the top in the LEC, but that's exactly where I think we are. I think jungle obviously has a case to be made, and depending on how you feel about the depth at AD carry, there really aren't bad starting AD carries. There's just not as many elite level AD carries. I think top lane is really the role where you're seeing the most amount of elite level talent at the top, and Photon is definitely a part of that. I didn't quite knock him down for being an import. I think there's an argument to be made that he could be a B grade because he's technically an import, but I honestly don't think it matters. I think he's clearly better than the players in B, to the point where I would have felt crazy to put him in the same tier as some of them, or at least in my mind I would have felt crazy, and so he's going to get a B+ here. But everybody else, all 4 other members of this roster, are changed from 2023 to 2024, and with how awfully everything went, I honestly agree with that decision. One of them's kind of a 0.5 change, and it's Douglas coming into play in the jungle. He obviously played the final week of the summer split here for Vitality instead of Bo, because they just wanted something that was going to be a little bit more consistent. Maybe they just wanted to give him a test drive to see if they wanted to go with him full-time for the upcoming year. Clearly, he passed that test because he is going to be their full-time jungler, at least to start the year. I'm not really sure where to land on Douglas. When I was watching tape for him last year, when I was kind of prepping for that summer split debut, I was really not impressed. I was like, this guy's average, he's okay, he plays for a decent Vitality B team. I just don't think he's going to be able to step in and be on this super team and actually be able to contribute. He's a decent carry jungler, but he's not really a facilitator. It didn't really feel like his playstyle meshed with everybody else. I wasn't sold on him, but the more I've gone back and watched some of his tape, which obviously I've watched a lot of tape for this video, I've actually been a little bit more impressed with what I've seen from him. He's a little bit more versatile than I think I was giving him credit for, which is why he's going to get the C+ tag. I originally had him at the C tag. It was him and Jackie's that were both C tags originally. I ended up bumping them both up to C+ because of the upside, but I think grade-wise, that's about right. They're both solid enough. I would expect Douglas to be fine, but honestly, there is a world where he's just not good enough, where he's being given an internal promotion because he's the best that they could do, and they wanted to go for something cheaper, even though there are better EU Masters and ERL junglers available for them. I don't know. I don't know what to expect from Douglas. I'm going to list this as a change for now. I know some people are going to criticize that because, man, we'll get to it. People really love Bo, and I get it, man. The flash, the good parts are there, but when he's bad, like, he's worse than anybody else in the league, and it's not particularly close. You don't see junglers going 0-10 like that in pro play, but Bo will go 0-10. He's going to get a B- grade for me in terms of his value. We'll talk about that a bit later for K-Corp. I have this listed as a change because I think Douglas, ironically enough, will offer a bit more stability, even as a rookie, than what Bo was offering, just because what you were getting out of Bo was so volatile and so unpredictable that you really wanted to move on and wanted to go in a different direction, and I totally understand that. Douglas just doesn't have nearly the same kind of mechanical upside that Bo has. You're not going to get the good games from Douglas in the same way that you would from Bo, but he could be a solid player, and maybe he outperforms what I'm expecting. And then you've got the mid lane change. This is also going to be considered kind of a neutral change from Perks to VTO. I think they're both really solid players that have had really bad tenures in recent years. Obviously, VTO last year with Excel before he joined Heretics, it just wasn't working out. He was looking awful individually. His lane stats were really suffering. His team fighting was really bad. His positioning in general was just not good. It felt like he was mentally checked out for a lot of last year, but Perks was kind of running into a similar story, especially down the stretch, where he was just inting games away. And I'm a Perks defender. I very much have been over the past couple of years. I'm not a hype train kind of guy. I really don't try to fall in love with league personalities, and I don't think I've done that here. I just think his performance on the Rift is often criticized in areas where it's not necessarily his fault. He's scapegoated for a lot of issues that his teams generally run into. I think that was definitely the case in 2022, 2 years ago, where he was a top 2 player in the LEC for that Vitality team, even though they couldn't quite get over the hump. They couldn't quite get into playoffs. And I think it was kind of the case last year as well, although it very much stopped being the case when this team really fell off the rails in Summer Split. I think good version of Perks is still there, but the good version of VTO is also still there. I think this is just a good change for Vitality. Clearly, Perks just wasn't working out in this organization with this coaching staff, with the, the organization's, leadership and support program. It just wasn't working, right? Perks on Vitality was not working out. Bringing in a player in VTO who, remember, I mean, last year, 2022, end of 2022, 2021, we were talking about this guy as like MVP material. He's a former MVP. People forget that. He was the 2022 Spring Split MVP. A lot of people forget that he was that good, but this is a top 1 kind of performance guy when everything is going well. VTO's mechanical ceiling is just as high as anybody else's. He's a massive carry player, and honestly, from an individual talent perspective, the solo lane duo of Photon and VTO is terrifying to have to play into. If you're getting Misfits VTO again, this is going to be a very scary duo, but, he just hasn't been that in the last year, and you're going to have to kind of plan around that. VTO right now has kind of been an okay mid laner, somebody who has had games where he's popped off, but has really been more of a meta breaker and somebody who has been, good at facilitating the rest of his team. If that's going to be the case here, obviously the ceiling is a little bit lower for what I think this Vitality team can do, but if VTO can get back to MVP level form, like really is not out of the realm of possibility for him. I mean, Vitality's upside's ridiculous if you have that solo lane duo, especially because you have this bot lane. You have Karzi and Hylissang coming over from Mad Lions. These two work together so well on that team. It's probably kind of jarring to see one listed as a downgrade and one listed as an upgrade. I have Upset to Karzi as a downgrade. I have Kaiser to Hylissang as an upgrade. That might seem very weird because I think a lot of people are going to say that Karzi outperformed Upset last year. My counter argument to that would be that Upset was fine generally for Vitality. He was really good in Spring Split, and then obviously Summer happened and everything fell apart. But if you're asking me who I'd rather have on my team, I would rather have Upset. And it's not close. Karzi's just very inconsistent. You're going to get good games, but you're going to get really bad games from Karzi. He is one of the few AD carries that will run it down and will int it away. Now that got significantly better over the course of the second half of the year. He's one of the few players who I think did play well in Summer Split, played some of his best League that he's played in quite a long time in Summer Split, but his return to Vitality here I don't think is going to be as dominant as maybe he's anticipating. I think people are overrating him a bit right now in terms of what they can expect from him in 2024. Maybe him and Hylissang really do have that kind of chemistry. Maybe it just clicked and they're going to be great, but I attribute a lot of the success of that bot lane to what Hilly was doing, and while I still think Karzi is a good asset, I mean, B is certainly not a bad grade for a player. I just don't I think Upset's a little bit more of a higher upside player than someone like Karzi is, which is why I have it listed as a downgrade. I think functionally it doesn't really matter. They're going to be relatively similar outputs, especially because of the synergy in the bot lane, but if you're just looking at the individual players, that would be my perception of it. And then you have Kaiser and Hylissang, or Kaiser going into Hylissang. This is an upgrade for me. Kaiser was actually not good last year. I know a lot of people have a lot of hype around Kaiser. He's been great for Mad Lions in the past, but last year was a really, really rough year. I think he showed that he was a bit meta-dependent. I think that was the big takeaway for me, was that if you take Kaiser out of metas where major engagers are very strong, like the Alistar and the Nautilus and things like that, he's just not going to be able to adapt nearly as well as some of the other supports at this level, so he drops to a B grade for me. He's been an B+, A- kind of grade guy on this channel over the course of his career, but I just couldn't justify that here, and I think Hylissang is definitely the better player. I think he proved that last year. He was awesome for Mad Lions. He's consistently been one of the best supports in Europe. End of 2022 on Fnatic aside, he's been fantastic in the LEC, and I don't see any reason to believe that he won't be that for Vitality here. Obviously, Karzi's got a pretty bad history with this organization, with what he was able to do with it in 2022, where he was genuinely one of the worst bot laners in the league. But, bringing Hilly over, having these two continue to, further their development and their synergy together as this really aggressive playmaking bot duo that's not afraid to get super active, I think that could definitely help. Add on to the fact that Photon's a very aggressive top laner. VTO can play a very aggressive style in the mid lane. This is a team that could run at you incredibly fast and do a ton of damage very quickly, but at the same time, they're going to be very volatile. Maybe not as volatile as last year's Vitality team, because it's just going to be hard to top the kind of collection of players that they were able to generate in 2023, but I still think this team has a lot of upside. This definitely world's upside from this Vitality team, which is just really what this org has been praying for over the past few years. I could see another world in which this goes wrong. If Douglas doesn't necessarily adapt, if VTO has another poor showing, if Karzi doesn't have another good year, if Hylissang starts to get a little bit overeager, like there are avenues where I think this Vitality team could underperform some of the expectations that we have for them, but I think the talent is definitely there for them to, at the very least, contend for one of those top 4 spots. And now we're moving on to one of the teams that I know you guys are one of the most excited to hear about. I wouldn't be surprised if you found the timestamps in the description and you skipped to this part of the video, because I understand you want to hear, a lot of thoughts on how this team is going to work. They are a very, very exciting offseason, and let's just go over it. It's, of course, Team Heretics. It's the final team that I guess is still in the LEC from 2023 to talk about in today's video. They made quite a few changes. The gang is back together. The top side of this map is entirely the peak of those G2 days, the 2019 G2 World Finals team days, alongside a couple of other very, very veteran members. Another former G2 member in the bot lane, just a little bit of a different time period, and then, of course, Kaiser, who's been around the block at support. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about it, how I think it's going to do in 2024, because it's not 2019. Is it going to be as successful? I'll kind of give my thoughts on whether or not I would have done this if I was Heretics, but their lineup last year was obviously Evie in the top lane, Jankos in the jungle, VTO in the mid lane, Flacket at AD carry, and Mursa at support. And they're going to Wunder in the top lane, Jankos in the jungle, Perks in the mid lane, Flacket at AD carry, and Kaiser at support. This is a very, very big change for a team that I think already had shown last year that they were willing to make moves and make adjustments to be relevant in the LEC. They wanted to be a top team. They went out mid-season and they got VTO from Excel. They got Flacket. I mean, they had Flacket, but they promoted Flacket and started him over Jack Spectra. They were willing to make moves midway through the year to try and improve their team, even if it meant bringing in bigger names and potentially paying bigger salaries for these players when they became available. And that obviously all transitions into this year, 2024, where they're really dishing out what I presume to be the bag. Now, obviously, there are reports that a lot of these players are taking some pay cuts to play with each other again. Players like Wunder and Perks are not exactly coming off the best splits of their entire career, but this is still a really stacked team, and especially in a landscape where basically every other team had to make a concession somewhere in terms of reliability or stability out of position. There are almost no teams that just universally got better. This is one of the few teams that you can look at and say, honestly, they kind of just got better across the board. So let's talk about it. Obviously, their franchise player, the one that they talked about last year wanting to build around, was Jankos, the legendary jungler here in the LEC, the best jungler in European League of Legends history. He continues to be on this team. He was awesome last year for them. Really was the saving grace at the beginning of the year. Got a lot of help as the year went on. Flacket was fantastic in the summer split. VTO obviously stepped up quite big. The two new additions were definitely positive for Heretics overall, but Jankos was the consistent thread, and if you were ever going to build around a player in this organization, it absolutely had to be him. He's going to get an A- grade. We've seen the three junglers that are going to get A- for me. It's Elyoya, it's Yike, it's Jankos. I think they are the three clear best junglers in the LEC right now. Whatever order you want to put them in, I think is relatively fine, but these are game-changing players, and to me, even with all the additions that they made, bringing in a lot of these very established players in big upgrade positions, Jankos is still the most valuable player on this team. Now, I do want to say some people might see him as the clear-cut number one, no-brainer, absolutely dominant jungler. I do think he got credit for a little bit too much last year. He was really, really good. I certainly don't want to take away the fact that he was one of the best junglers in the LEC, but I saw most people, especially like on Reddit and on Twitter, like saying Jankos for MVP. I just was never in that discussion. It was never even on my mind. He was a good player. He was a borderline all-pro caliber jungler, but, I think the MVP conversation was a little bit over my head in terms of the performances he was actually putting out. He just wasn't consistent enough. There were some really good games, and obviously, he did a lot for this team, but I think that's underestimating the effect that players like Flacket and VTO had on this team last year. So I love Jankos. I still think he's the most valuable player on this team specifically because of recent form. But, he's not this perfect end-all be-all number one jungler no matter what. I think there are going to be circumstances where, other junglers might be able to do some things that Jankos isn't as comfortable doing. He's just going to be the most versatile and the most consistent out of all of them. And so you're going to be very happy to have him. The other player you bring back is Flacket in the bot lane. This was a fantastic decision to promote him midway through the year. I don't think a lot of people expected him to come in and be as good as he was. Now, obviously, that didn't last super long. It is very clear that Flacket came in with a bunch of confidence and with a bunch of momentum and was able to really dominate. That first week, he was back week one of the summer split, those 3 games that Heretics played. That was the best week any AD carry played in 2023 in the LEC. Flacket was phenomenal. He was dominating every game, was absolutely taking over. Wasn't quite as dominant down the stretch, especially when this team needed him in the playoffs, but still a very valuable player and one that obviously has synergy with the jungler here, and that's going to be very important and is good friends with everybody on this team, at least if the rumors are to be believed. And so, it's definitely good to keep him. He's only going to get a B because, again, he has to prove it over a larger sample size, but there is, a world where he shows up as a top 2, top 3 AD carry in the league this year. He's certainly shown flashes of that over the course of his career. I just don't know if I'm confident enough to say that that's definitely going to happen. He joins the cluster of AD carries that I have in the B tier. It's basically every AD carry in this list. So, again, I can't stress enough. They're basically all in their one giant hodgepodge of AD carries. One of them's going to break out and be a top 3 bot laner. I just don't know which one it is, but Flakkid's really good. And then you've got the 3 changes. We'll start with Wunder in the top lane. This is, in my opinion, the biggest upgrade that this team is making. Evie was really not good for this team. Now, I do think there were times where his shortcomings got scapegoated a little bit too much, just as I think Jankos got a little bit too much credit for being, quote-unquote, the only good player on this team. I think Evie sometimes got a little bit too much flame for being, quote-unquote, the only bad player on this team. It's very rarely as black and white as that, and I don't think it was over the course of last year, but you would be remiss to say that Evie wasn't one of the worst top laners in the LEC last year, and you're going from him to Wunder, who's just been stable his entire career. He spent the last year on the bench with the exception of the winter split, which is obviously not ideal, but he came in the season finals when Fnatic needed a top laner when Oscar was getting surgery, and he performed just as well as you could ask him to. Honestly, he was better than Oscar when he was playing, and so I think this B grade is pretty pessimistic if we're being honest. He's probably a lot closer to a B+, and again, this just goes back to this idea where you're running like 4, 5, 6 top laners deep at B+ in the LEC. This is the deepest and strongest role in the region. Wunder slots right into that, but he's incredibly solid. You're not going to be frustrated. You're not going to feel let down at all by the production of Wunder. I expect him to slot right back into what he was the last couple of years. I was very high on him going into 2023. I thought his 2022 was great. Obviously, a lot went wrong in 2023, but he really wasn't bad, and so I expect him to be one of the best top laners again, just like he's been his whole career. And then you've got Perks. This is the other side of the Vitality Heretics swap here. VTO going to Vitality, Perks coming over here to Heretics. It's really up for debate who you think is getting the better end of this deal. I think VTO was better in 2023 because he had that good, summer split, but Perks was a lot better before that. VTO was miserable on Excel in the first 2 splits. So, it really is upside for both of these players, but we've seen what Perks can do at his absolute best. Again, I have to reiterate, I think Perks has been given a really bad reputation when he doesn't necessarily deserve it. I do think he is better than people say he is. He was an MVP finalist for me and for basically everybody in 2022 summer, and he was really good in winter as well. At the beginning of the year, when Vitality was winning in spring, a lot of that was through Perks as well, and so you do want to give him a lot of credit for the good that he's done. He just hasn't been consistent by any stretch. This is the kind of roster that can get him consistent again. Jankos is a very consistent jungler. Wunder is a very consistent top laner. That is a very good duo to end up being able to play off of. Bot lane, not exactly as consistent, which we will get to, but again, just like I did for Vitality, I'm going to list this as a change because I could see a world where VTO is just better, specifically if he's getting more resources. If Perks becomes a little bit too volatile for this team and ends up being a little bit up and down like he was for Vitality over the past 2 years, then VTO might be the better player, but I think there's a high chance that Perks really resumes his spot as a top 3 mid laner in the LEC by the end of the year, and I think a lot of that is the surrounding core here. And then you've got Flakkid and Kaiser. Already talked about Flakkid, but Kaiser, I think, is also going to be considered an upgrade here. Now, this is a little bit more debatable. I like Mursa. People hate Mursa. Again, everybody wanted a scapegoat on Heretics. It was just very common for people to be like, Jankos 1v9. I hate everybody else on this team. Let's just find every small little play and mistake that these guys make and point them out, as if not every, player in the league was making these mistakes at some point, specifically in that support position. Mursa's an okay support at the LEC level. He was better on Misfits. That is absolutely the case. I'm not going to try to deny that even a little bit, but he has upside, and he was pretty decent for most of the year. He had a couple of bad games, but I'm not going to sit here and scapegoat Mursa and say he was the worst player on Heretics. And honestly, Kaiser gave a very similar output last year. Kaiser was not good for Vitality, and so why am I listing this as an upgrade? Well, I just have faith that Kaiser is going to be able to rebound and get back on track a little bit more than I would expect Mursa to be able to put out in 2024. I think if you're actively choosing between the two, with Mursa obviously going teamless, Kaiser was the right decision. His track record speaks for itself. There is the potential for him to re-break out as a top 1, top 2 support in the LEC, because that's what he was at his best best. He was the #1 support in Europe, and I think this partnership with Fnatic has the potential to be very good. But like I said, when you're thinking about this team, I'm a little bit worried about the volatility. Wunder and Jankos I don't have that issue with, but Kaiser is a really big reason why that is something I want to bring up, because he is a very volatile support. He's somebody who does like engages, but he is going to make some bad plays every once in a while. Even at his best on Mad Lions, he was still a little bit over-eager in some circumstances. Flacket is certainly not a player that is going to turn down a skirmish in the mid-game, and we know Perks likes to int randomly in random games throughout the year, and so that is certainly something to keep in mind. But with all of these guys being such close friends and having such good synergy together, especially the top side of this map that we already know has good synergy on the Rift, I would expect a lot of those problems to end up getting weeded out. Back when Perks was playing with these guys, they were the most synergistic team in the world. Perks was considered one of the best shot callers in the world back in the day, if people can remember that. And, you know, I think it could be similar here on Heretics. There is a high likelihood that this team is very, very good, but I would temper expectations. I've been seeing some conversations about them immediately being able to challenge G2. I think that might be a little rich for what I'm expecting from this year. I think G2 is just kind of in a league of their own right now, but Heretics is probably, in my opinion, as close as it gets at the current moment. And that's going to bring us to our final team that we talk about in today's long video. I really do hope you guys are enjoying it. Offseason is just starting, but the analysis is really kicking off, and it's going to be the new team to the LEC that ends our video today. It's gonna be Karmine Corp. They are taking over for Astralis, and they have finally made their way into the LEC. How has it taken them this long? How has it taken K-Corp this long to get into the LEC? It feels like they should have been in years ago, but finally, this org that has invested so much into the LFL, that has dominated the ERLs, that has just won EU Masters, is going to be making their way into the LEC, and they're going to be doing it with a lot of the players that got them here in the first place. Now, I am going to, talk about what's up on the screen on the left. It's not K-Corp's roster from 2023. We will be talking about K-Corp's roster from 2023, but for brevity's sake, I figured I would put Astralis' roster. That is the spot, quote-unquote, in this league that they are taking the place of, and so, these are the players that are losing their LEC spots in order for K-Corp to come in and play the players that they are playing. I think that was a more appropriate way of talking about how this team was going to integrate itself, whether or not they were going to be a better version of Astralis, but of course, I will also talk about whether or not the changes that they made were upgrades or downgrades in comparison to what they were playing with in the LFL, because I think that's also an interesting conversation. So kind of a 3-for-1 instead of a regular one here in this final one of the video for K-Corp, but obviously, Astralis' lineup last year was Finn in the top lane, 113 in the jungle, Leader in the mid lane, Kobe at AD carry, and Jonghoon at support. K-Corp's lineup in 2023 was, of course, Cabochard in the top lane, Syncroft in the jungle, Seiken in the mid lane, Kalist in the bot lane, and Targamas in the support position. It's a very interesting lineup, but kind of a combination there. Their 2024 lineup is looking like Cabochard in the top lane, Bo in the jungle, Seiken in the mid lane, Upset at AD carry, and Targamas at support. Certainly some interesting conversations to be had here on whether or not this team is looking as strong as some people would want it to be moving into this year. I think they did exactly the right thing. A lot of the players, or more than half of this roster, I should say, coming up from the LFL, which is absolutely the right decision. A lot of these players have dominated for this organization, and I'm sure they've been promised opportunities. I'm not sure, morally where that would stand, but like, Cabochard's been with this team, even though I'm sure he's been receiving LEC offers. Seiken has been with this team, even though we know he's been receiving LEC offers. We know these players have been given opportunities to take LEC jobs, but they wanted to stick with K-Corp, and it really is paying off for them. Obviously, a couple of guys coming in from Vitality, Targamas sticking with this team. He played for them at the end of the year last year in the LFL when they were really dominating, and in EU Masters, but of course, played for Excel last year, has played for G2 here in the LEC, has certainly had his time in the spotlight. It's just kind of a perfect, I guess, encapsulation of everything that K-Corp should be, and this could be a really good team this year. We'll talk about why I think there's some positivity and why there might be a little bit more hesitancy from me than maybe some other analysts out there. There's a lot of good things to talk about, but there are also some concerns, especially playstyle-wise, but let's talk about the players that are staying on K-Corp, the players who have been here. Cabochard in the top lane is about as synonymous with this, organization, with this team as you could possibly get. He has been there for so long, and you consistently hear him talked about as one of the best top laners in the ERLs, in the EU Masters scene, in the LFL, wherever you want to talk about. And, he passes the eye test when that comes to fruition. When you go and watch K-Corp tape, when you go and watch the EU Masters tape, Cabochard is basically everything that he is made out to be. Now, some people might be looking at these grades and seeing them as significantly too low. I can understand where you're coming from with that, but the thing with Cabo that I want to make incredibly clear is I don't know if I was sold on the idea that he's going to come in and dominate in lane at the LEC level. I do think that that is something that could be possible. He's a very good weak side top laner and somebody who really isn't given a ton of resources, but he is gankable. That is certainly something that I found out when watching tape, is I really expected him to be a little bit more stable in the early game when facing a lot of early aggression, and that just wasn't necessarily the case. Now, I don't think that is something that, you know, might always be a problem, but I think C+ is relatively fair for somebody that I'm expecting to come in and be a good top laner. Remember, you know, C+ is, you know, fine as a starter. Somebody that has upside to be better, and if Cabo end of the year is a B or a B-, I'm not going to be shocked at all. There's just a lot of really good competition in the top lane, and I think in general this is, you know, one that I'm, you know, going to be watching out for a bit more, and so he's going to get a C+ grade. I have it listed as a change from Finn. Obviously, it's no change from K-Corp last year. I think he's essentially going to be Finn. I know I gave Finn a better grade than him, but I see them as very similar players. Finn's just done it at a higher level for a little while, and so if you like Finn, then you're probably going to like Cabochard. They're going to be pretty similar in terms of the output that I think they give, or at least that's what I'm expecting going into the year. And then you've got Seiken in the mid lane, the other player that's just been sticking around this organization for a long time. You know, I talked about Cabo being a really solid top laner, somebody that I'm excited to finally see back in the LEC. You know, Seiken kind of getting his first opportunity here, or his first real opportunity here, and he's more exciting, in my opinion. I think Seiken has upside to be significantly better than a lot of the other mid laners that we've talked about here. Again, I know I'm giving him a C+, but as you can see with a lot of the players that are a little bit less experienced at this level, even a player that I really like, you know, players like Supa and Alvaro and Frescoe and Jackies, these other interesting young players that are getting called up, I just want to be on the safer side and give them lower grades at the start. Maybe Seiken turns into a B, B+ kind of mid laner. I don't even think that's out of the realm of possibility. He was really good this past year, especially at EU Masters, but I think he was a really fun player to watch, and I just think for now, I'm going to keep him in this department. Leader's a really good player. He gets a B grade for me, but I still consider this a change, because I think it's very likely by the end of the year, you're actually going to get more out of Seiken than you would out of someone like Leader when you're taking this spot. Of course, Seiken also remaining from K-Corp in 2023, and so that's a no change when you're looking at that roster, but Seiken's a really solid player, and I'm very, very excited for him to get this opportunity. Some people might be looking at these grades and, you know, already yelling at me in the comment section about how I'm biased in the wrong direction, or I hate K-Corp or whatever. I hope you guys listen and you see the upside. I'm excited for Seiken. I certainly don't think that he will perform exactly like this C+. It's just a kind of a to-be-determined grade for Seiken there. And then obviously Targamas staying at support. I think that this is a pretty solid move. Targamas is a player that I've gone through kind of the phase with. I had as my #1 support going into last year after that year on G2 where he set the assist record. It wasn't just stats, obviously. He showed a ton on tape with that G2 team. It really felt like the bot lane problems were more, I don't want to say flaccid, but were more, you know, draft-oriented and playstyle-oriented than they were just like Targamas not being good enough to be able to carry at Worlds, and so I felt very good about him going to Excel, but man, did things not work out at Excel. It was about as disastrous as you could possibly ask for it to be. He was one of the worst supports that we've seen in the LEC in a while. He ends up getting cut after one split, just the winter split. Not even halfway through the year, he ends up going back to K-Corp, and he was awesome for this team once again. That bot lane by the end of the year of Kalist and Targamas was genuinely sensational. We'll talk about Kalist because I think that he's very important towards talking about 2023 K-Corp. He was such a mega carry for this team, but he's not old enough to be able to play for this team, and so they brought in a pretty decent replacement, I'll say. I will say Targamas is going to be considered a downgrade when you compare him to someone like Jonghoon. I think Jonghoon has just shown that he is a very consistently great support at this level. He is very rightfully gotten a spot back in the LCK, which we will talk about when we talk about the LCK video, but I just don't see Targamas as having that kind of floor. Does Targamas have the same kind of upside? Yeah, I really do think Targamas can be a top 1 support in the league. That's what I thought last year. It's just, it really hasn't shown on tape over the past year or so, and so you're kind of hoping for that development, but B- I think is relatively fair for what he's shown at the LEC level, even if he was a lot better in the LFL and in the EU Masters. And then you've got the 2 Vitality players coming over. We'll start with Upset because I think that's a more interesting conversation. Obviously, you're going from Kalist to Upset. I think that there's certainly some conversation to be had around that. Is Upset, like, definitely better? I mean, you would hope so, because it's Upset, and he's like a top 2 AD carry in EU. He's really a top 2 ADC in the LEC, and I have him listed as such. He's one of the 2 AD carries to actually get a B+ grade for me, which is why I consider an upgrade to Kabe, but you know, Khalees could be just as good. Like, it's really not out of the realm of possibility for him to be as good. He dominated the LFL. I don't know if this is a placeholder. I don't know if this is a holdover. I don't think Upset would have signed on if this was a holdover or a placeholder. I think he feels like this is his opportunity to really kind of find a spot and settle into it. I've always liked Upset. His mechanics are ridiculous. He's the most talented AD carry in the region, and it's not particularly close, which is why he continues to get really high grades for me. Even when he does have some down splits and some down games, he really has not been consistent. Over the past year, the Vitality, you know, just run was not good, but his 2022 Fnatic, I think, run was a lot better than people gave it credit for. He was the best AD carry in Europe, in my opinion, in 2022, and so I still trust Upset. He's one of the 2 AD carries to actually break that B mold and get that B+, and so you do want to give him a lot of credit for that, but again, he could underperform this as well. He's in that cluster with every other AD carry that we've kind of talked about in terms of the performances that they offer. It's just a big volatile group in the LEC, and then, speaking of volatile, you've got Bo coming in to play jungle. Now, I know I'm going to make people mad when I say this, but I'm like a lot lower on Bo than a lot of other people are. I see the upside. I see the good games. Trust me, I get it. But, last year, Bo was a major negative for Vitality when you look at the grand scheme of things. He lost significantly more games than he won for that team. He was a net negative on that team overall. And honestly, in my opinion, he was the biggest reason why that team ended up underperforming. Now you're asking him to come in to a team that does have an established dynamic with players like Cabo, Seiken, Targamas, you know, really knowing how to play together, a player in Upset who's pretty resource heavy, and you're asking Bo to be that jungler. Well, Bo is really only shown to be a resource heavy jungler at this level. Even in his time in the LDL back in China, he really wasn't like this facilitating jungler. He wasn't somebody that played Sejuani and Maokai at a high level. He's just not that kind of player, and so I do find it a little bit jarring to just kind of drag and drop and insert him into this team. I think this team could have done better with, you know, someone like Marcoon or you know, one of the other more facilitative-minded junglers that were available on the market. I like Bo as a player. Obviously, his mechanics are ridiculous. He has the upside to be one of the more interesting junglers in the league. I'm just a bit worried about the fit on this team, if I'm being honest. I've been seeing basically nothing but hype for this team, and I think, I hate to say it, maybe I'm going to get flack for this, but Bo is a lot more of a name right now than he is like an asset as a player. And hopefully he can prove me wrong on that. Hopefully he can come out and, you know, be a lot better than he was in 2023, but it's just hard for me to predict that. He has played the same kind of style his entire career, and when you look at the rest of the players on this team, I just don't think it fits. You know, Seiken and Cabo are going to have to take a pretty major step back in terms of the resources that they want, and Upset and Targamas are going to have to be a major focal point for this team. It just is a very weird construction for a team that I think is very well-rounded. Obviously, this coaching staff is very experienced, and they're lauded for a good reason. They should be able to figure this all out, but I don't think it's as simple as saying that this is a very talented roster that's just going to be able to get it done. I think there are reasons to believe that they might be a little bit, you know, worse off earlier on than people want them to be. I could see them making some substitutions, some changes midway through the year if things don't end up going right. You know, Syncroft doesn't have a team right now, which is crazy, but I could absolutely see that being a move that they want to go towards if at all possible. But for now, this team really is volatile, but man, is there upside there. If everything clicks, like, this is a Worlds team. I know I've said that a bunch, but the middle tier of the LEC is incredibly close right now. I have a few more question marks about k-corp than I do about some of the other teams that we've mentioned here, but if their upside isn't there, if you're saying the upside isn't there, that's just a lie. This team can be as good as any of the other teams that we've talked about today. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC 2024 offseason rumor video. My player grades, everything, my offseason analysis. I do hope you guys enjoyed all 10 teams in the bag covered. If you really did enjoy the video, it would mean a lot to me if you left a like on it. I don't know how many new people this is going to reach, but we've uploaded a ton of League of Legends content over the course of this year. We covered every single game in the LCS, the LEC, the LPL, the LCK all year long. long, all the international tournaments, everything, even the NACL. We've covered a lot on this channel, and so the breadth of knowledge is there. We're going to be making this video again for the other 3 regions as well. LCS will probably come out next, followed by the LCK and then the LPL whenever they start to figure their stuff out, but I'm really, really excited to get these off-season videos out to you guys. Let me know if you enjoyed them. Of course, leave a like if you did. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you are new here, if you're one of the people that found me through this video, hit the subscribe button. If you enjoyed my analysis on this long-form kind of in-depth analysis, I promise you're going to like a lot of the rest of the content on this channel. We cover LoL Esports as a whole, so whether you're into the LEC, any of the other regions, all of them, only one of them, we're going to cover it all just as in-depth on this channel. You're going to want to hit subscribe, and you're going to want to hit that bell so you can be notified when the rest of those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all